Beneath the endless Mediterranean sky, where sun and salt carve the stone like time itself, rises an island that has watched empires fall. Malta, a fortress adrift between continents, closer to myth than to geography. From afar, it looks like a rock of gold floating on a sea of sapphire. But within its limestone veins, beneath its silent cathedrals and beneath its streets carved by faith and blood, lies one of the oldest surviving mysteries of Western civilization, the Order of the Knights of Malta. The story begins not with a battle, but with a silence. The kind of silence that lingers before a secret is told. Tourists walking the bastions of Valletta see cannons and carved crosses, but few notice the tunnels that run beneath them. Passages where torches once flickered and voices whispered prayers that sounded like codes. Beneath the city's Baroque beauty, archives sealed for centuries guard a truth so strange it outlived kings, Crusades, and even the authority of the Vatican itself. In these tunnels, it's said that relics of impossible origin were hidden, maps that didn't belong to their century, fragments of knowledge older than Christianity. Priests spoke of visions, soldiers spoke of oaths, and both spoke of fear. For Malta was not just a stronghold. It was the final sanctuary of a brotherhood born in faith, hardened by war, and cloaked in mystery. The Knights of Malta, the only warrior monks who defied not only their enemies, but the very church that created them. Centuries ago, this same island was little more than a barren rock, unremarkable, almost forgotten. Yet somehow, it became the throne of a sovereign order that commanded fleets, minted its own currency, and held diplomatic power rivaling kingdoms. Popes blessed them, kings feared them, and ordinary men could never understand them. They were healers and killers, monks and pirates, saints and sinners, contradictions forged into a single oath. And when the Vatican demanded obedience, they did something unthinkable. They said no. The night winds over Malta still carry the echo of that defiance. In the Grand Master's palace, a place where every marble corridor feels like a confession, portraits of long-dead knights stare from the walls, eyes painted to follow the intruder. Beneath one of those portraits, hidden behind a gilded frame, a small Latin inscription once read, "Non serviam," I will not serve. Legend claims it was scratched into the wall by a Grand Master who believed his authority came not from Rome, but from God himself. What kind of faith breeds such rebellion? What secret gave them the courage to challenge the Vatican? An institution that crushed the Templars, excommunicated emperors, and ruled by divine decree. Some historians will say it was politics. Others whisper it was something older, something the Church feared, an unbroken current of knowledge stretching back to the Crusades, perhaps even before. Whatever it was, it made the knights untouchable. Even after their castles fell, their power endured in unseen ways, through banking networks, diplomatic immunity, and symbols that appear quietly on government seals and humanitarian emblems even today. The Order of Malta never truly disappeared. It simply learned to exist in the spaces between faith and power. But to understand why this secret society defied the Vatican, we have to strip away the centuries of reverence and propaganda that protect its story. We have to go back to the beginning, before the marble palaces, before the naval fleets, before the blood-soaked banners of the cross. Back to a time when a handful of men built a hospital in the chaos of the Holy Land, believing they were serving God by healing the wounded. They had no idea they were founding a power that would one day outlast the very Crusades that gave birth to it. Malta's stones remember. In the stillness of its catacombs, the air is heavy with the scent of dust and candle wax. The walls whisper names that time erased. Grand masters who brokered peace and waged war, confessors who burned heretics, and novices who took vows of silence that lasted until death. Somewhere, in one of these tombs, lies the first clue to their defiance, a relic that the Vatican once demanded and never received. Some say it was a fragment of the true cross. Others, something far more dangerous: knowledge. As night falls over the island, the modern world feels far away. The same stars that guided Crusader ships now glimmer above Valletta's walls. Somewhere, a bell tolls from St. John's Co-Cathedral, deep, solemn, echoing like a heartbeat beneath stone. The narrator's voice would drop to a whisper. Here, in this place, Faith became power, and power became its own religion. The Knights of Malta did not simply serve God. They served a vision of divine order that placed them above kings and popes alike. And for centuries, they guarded that vision with a secrecy so complete that even today, no one knows where their archives truly end. Every civilization leaves behind its ruins, its cathedrals, its laws, its myths. But the Order of Malta left behind something rarer. Continuity. Still exists. It still issues passports, commands embassies, and answers to no earthly nation. A medieval brotherhood that became a modern state without land. How? Why? The answers lie buried in the contradictions that made them immortal: compassion and conquest, sanctity and sin. Their defiance of the Vatican was not a single act, but a slow awakening, a realization that power could wear the mask of holiness. And once they understood that truth, they refused to give it back. So, as the camera drifts over the golden ramparts of Valletta, the music swells, half sacred, half ominous. The narrator concludes the opening. This is not the story of rebels. It is the story of believers who became what they feared most. A church within the church, a power without a throne. This is the secret of the Knights of Malta. And with that, the screen fades to black, leaving one final question echoing in the viewer's mind. What secret was so dangerous that even the Vatican could not destroy it? In the 11th century, long before Malta's walls rose from the sea, the world was drowning in chaos. Europe was fractured by feudal wars, and the roads to Jerusalem were thick with the bones of pilgrims. Men and women who had walked thousands of miles through desert and blood to touch the soil where Christ had once stood. The Holy Land, however, was not a place of peace. It was a crucible, and from its fire, something extraordinary would be forged. A brotherhood born from faith, forged in service, and destined to become one of the most powerful secretive orders in human history. In the year 1048, amid the crowded markets and shimmering heat of Jerusalem, a small group of Christian merchants from Amalfi built a hospital near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It was a simple place, a cluster of stone rooms where the sick could rest and be tended. The men who ran it were not warriors or nobles. They were monks devoted to healing, bound by charity and humility. Their leader, a man known only as Brother Gerard, could not have imagined that his modest hospital would one day become the foundation of an empire of knights. The hospital became a sanctuary in a city divided by faith and sword. Crusaders came and went, pilgrims arrived broken and fevered, and through it all, the monks of St. John treated everyone, Christian, Jew, or Muslim. Their creed was mercy, yet the world they lived in was merciless. When the First Crusade erupted in 1096, the streets of Jerusalem ran red. The very city that had been built to heal became a battleground. The monks who had once wrapped wounds with linen now found themselves surrounded by fire and cries for vengeance. In this storm of blood, compassion became resistance. Brother Gerard's followers refused to abandon their calling. They sheltered the wounded regardless of allegiance, an act of radical humanity that both inspired and infuriated. When the Crusaders finally seized Jerusalem in 1099, the Order of St. John, as they were beginning to be called, emerged not as martyrs but as survivors. And survival in those days required strength. The line between healer and warrior began to blur. Under the leadership of Gerard's successor, Raymond Dupuy, the order received papal recognition from Pope Paschal II in 1113. With that decree, they were granted independence from all local authority, answering only to God and the Pope himself. It was the birth of something entirely new, a religious order that could wield the sword as well as the cross. Their hospitals multiplied across the Holy Land, but so did their fortresses. Their monks learned to fight. Their robes of black bore the white eight-pointed cross, the same symbol that centuries later would mark their defiance on Malta's walls. The transformation was slow but inevitable. Each battle, each siege, each funeral carved away a piece of their original mercy. The world demanded not only healing hands but defending blades. By the mid-12th century, the Order of St. John had become known as the Knights Hospitaller, guardians of the sick, protectors of pilgrims, and sworn soldiers of Christ. Their vows were as fierce as their faith. Poverty, chastity, obedience, and service. Yet service, in this context, often meant war. Imagine them riding across the sunburned hills of the Levant, armor glinting beneath banners embroidered with the white cross. They prayed before battle, confessed before dawn, and fought until their hands bled through their gauntlets. To them, every sword stroke was a prayer, every wound a sacrifice. But faith is a dangerous weapon. What began as divine devotion soon became divine entitlement. They believed they were chosen, not merely by the Pope, but by God himself, to preserve the Holy Land at any cost. The paradox of their existence deepened. By day, they tended to the dying. By night, they built walls and planned campaigns. Their hospitals stood beside their armories. And while their lips recited psalms, their hearts hardened to the cries of the conquered. Even among the Crusader states, the Knights of St. John became known for their discipline and their secrecy. They were respected, yes, but also feared. Their loyalties seemed to drift between the cross and their own growing sense of destiny. As centuries passed, the Holy Land began to fracture under relentless pressure. Muslim armies, united under brilliant leaders like Saladin, reclaimed what the Crusaders had seized. One by one, Christian strongholds fell. The Hospitallers fought valiantly but could not hold Jerusalem. In 1187, the city that had birthed their order was lost. And yet they did not vanish. Instead, they withdrew first to Acre, then to Cyprus, and later to Rhodes. Each exile stripped them of land but not of purpose. Somewhere in this long pilgrimage from holy service to holy war, their faith began to change. No longer were they simply servants of God's will. They had become interpreters of it. The Pope remained their formal superior, but distance, bloodshed, and power had already bred a quiet independence. They built their own fleets, minted their own coins, and negotiated treaties as equals with kings. To the common man, they were monks. To monarchs, they were sovereigns. Their legends spread across Europe, tales of healing miracles, divine victories, and treasures hidden within monastery walls. Yet behind the miracles were men, scarred, weary, and burdened with contradictions they could never confess. They believed in God, but they also believed in themselves, in the permanence of their order. When Rome faltered, they stood. When kings fell, they endured. The idea of obedience, the cornerstone of their vows, had begun to crack. And it is within that fracture between obedience and autonomy, between service and supremacy, that their true story begins. The world would soon call them the Knights of Malta, but their identity was already more than a title. They were becoming something the Church could not fully control, a power rooted in faith yet unbound by it. Looking back, it's easy to see the transformation as inevitable. History rarely creates saints without making them sinners first. The monks of the hospital had walked a narrow path between humility and ambition, and somewhere along the way, they chose both. The same cross that once represented compassion now gleamed from shields carried into war. Their charity saved lives. Their swords ended them. Yet in their eyes, there was no contradiction, only purpose. The order's founding legend of mercy in a world of cruelty would become its shield for centuries. But the seed of defiance had already been planted. In serving both God and their own survival, they learned a dangerous truth. To serve purely is to perish. To endure, one must rule. And that single revelation, born in the blood and dust of the Crusades, would echo across the ages, carrying the knights from the deserts of the Holy Land to the storm-beaten ramparts of Malta, where their faith, their pride, and their defiance would one day challenge even the Vatican itself. The cross and the crescent had faced each other for centuries, but never with such intensity as in the 12th and 13th centuries. The Holy Land had become a chessboard where faith and empire moved their pieces in blood. And at the center of it all stood the Knights of St. John, once healers, now hardened by crusade. They had built hospitals for the suffering, but now the world called upon them to defend the gates of Christendom. Their swords glimmered beneath banners embroidered with the white eight-pointed cross, the same emblem that would one day define Malta. Yet in these early years, it was still a symbol of service, purity, and defiance against the growing tide of the crescent. The order's transformation from caregivers to warriors was not a single act but a slow, relentless evolution driven by necessity. After Jerusalem's conquest by the Crusaders in 1099, the newly formed Christian states found themselves surrounded by enemies and plagued by constant attack. The monks who once offered bread and bandages learned to carry swords, not for glory but survival. The fortress hospitals they built in Jerusalem and Acre became citadels, each wall a testament to both faith and fear. It was in this crucible that the Knights Hospitaller forged their dual identity. Part priest, part soldier, servants of God who killed in his name. Their rise was swift. They developed their own army, navy, and even a governing council. While other Crusader factions squabbled over territory and pride, the Hospitallers focused on endurance. They established commanderies across Europe in France, Italy, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, each sending gold, recruits, and supplies to the Holy Land. Slowly, their network became an empire in miniature, answerable only to their Grand Master and, in theory, the Pope. But in practice, they were growing far too powerful for anyone to command. The lines between mercy and conquest blurred further with each battle. Their hospitals remained open, but the scent of incense was now mixed with the smell of iron and oil. They prayed before battle, believing that to die by the sword in defense of the faith was the highest form of sacrifice. And yet, beneath this holy fervor, a quiet unease spread among them. Could a man heal and kill in the same breath and still be righteous? Could violence truly serve God's will? The Hospitallers buried their doubts under armor and ritual, but the question never truly left them. By the mid-12th century, their reputation had spread beyond the Holy Land. Pilgrims arriving from Europe sought their protection. Kings sought their alliance. Their fortresses, such as Croc de Chevaliers in modern Syria, stood like stone miracles, immense, impregnable, and built with an understanding of war that rivaled any empire. The Hospitallers' redoubt at Croc was both monastery and machine, a place where prayer echoed through halls lined with weapons. It was said that even the sound of their chants could unnerve enemies, a harmony of devotion and dread. But while their influence expanded, the world around them began to crumble. The Muslim forces, once divided, united under one banner, that of Salah ad-Din, known in the West as Saladin. Charismatic, brilliant, and deeply devout, he represented the unity that the fractured Crusader states lacked. In 1187, he swept through the Holy Land like a divine wind, retaking Jerusalem and scattering the Christian armies. For the Hospitallers, it was not just a defeat but an existential crisis. The city that had given them life was gone. Their hospitals were destroyed, their patients slaughtered, their holy relics lost. Those who survived fled to the coastal fortress of Acre, the last bastion of Crusader power. Here, the Hospitallers regrouped, rebuilding their walls and their faith. The Pope called for new crusades, and the knights answered each one, again and again, fighting for a dream that was dying. They became the soul of a crusade that refused to accept death. Through the next century, they adapted like no other order. When Jerusalem was gone, they turned to the sea. Their ships, painted black and bearing the White Cross, began to patrol the Mediterranean. They rescued pilgrims, attacked corsairs, and raided Muslim fleets. Some called it holy war. Others called it piracy in the name of God. Either way, the Order of St. John was becoming a power not just of faith, but of commerce and fear. And then, in 1291, Acre, their final stronghold in the Holy Land, fell. The Crusader dream was over. The surviving knights boarded ships and fled into the horizon, their banners tattered but not broken. It should have been the end of their story. Yet, for the Knights Hospitaller, exile became opportunity. They sailed first to Cyprus, where they rebuilt their base of operations. The island's rulers, wary of their growing strength, treated them with suspicion. But the knights were patient. They had learned from centuries of loss that power was not about land, it was about endurance. On Cyprus, they restructured their order into a disciplined, almost monastic military government. Every rank, every ritual had meaning. The Grand Master became not just a leader but a living symbol of divine authority. Still, Cyprus was only a stepping stone. The order's eyes turned southward, toward a place they believed destiny had reserved for them: Rhodes. In 1309, They captured it from the Byzantine Empire and began transforming the island into one of the most fortified strongholds in the world. The Knights Hospitaller were no longer wanderers, they were sovereigns. From the ashes of Jerusalem, a new identity had been born. The cross of St. John, once the mark of humble caregivers, now flew above fleets and fortresses. Their enemies saw them as holy warriors. The Vatican saw them as valuable but dangerous. The people saw them as both saviors and tyrants. But within their walls, a different truth simmered, that the order no longer existed solely to serve the Church, but to serve its own vision of divine order. In the centuries that followed, their battles with the Ottomans and their defiance of kings would forge their legend. Yet even here in these early years the path was clear. They had begun as healers, yet war had shaped them into something far greater and far darker. Their faith had not weakened. It had evolved. To them, violence was not sin but sacrament. The cross and the crescent would continue to clash, across oceans and generations. But the Knights of St. John, the future Knights of Malta, had already discovered a truth that would define them for 1,000 years. Faith, when tempered by steel, can outlive any empire. And as the sun set over the ruins of Jerusalem, their ships cut across the waves, black sails against a crimson sky, bearing a cross that no longer stood for mercy, but for dominion. The war for the soul of Christendom had only just begun, and the men who once healed the wounded were now ready to wound the world in the name of God. Exile is a strange kind of death, one that leaves the body alive but strips away the soul's anchor. When the Knights of St. John fled the Holy Land after the fall of Acre in 1291, they carried with them little more than relics, scars, and an unyielding sense of purpose. The dream of Jerusalem was gone, its walls reclaimed by the crescent. Yet the knights refused to believe their mission had ended. They saw their exile not as punishment, but as divine test, a purgatory from which they would rise renewed. What they could no longer defend on land, they vowed to command upon the sea. The Mediterranean became their new battlefield, a vast and restless frontier between Christendom and the Ottoman world. For years, the surviving knights wandered from port to port, Cyprus, Crete, and even Italy, seeking refuge, favor, and resources. Wherever they went, they were tolerated but never truly welcomed. Kings saw them as useful soldiers, the Vatican as loyal servants in theory but liabilities in practice. Their reputation for secrecy, wealth, and independence had already begun to trouble the Church that had once blessed them. The order had always balanced two identities: monks sworn to poverty and warriors sworn to conquest. But exile sharpened that contradiction into something more dangerous. On foreign shores, their vows became less about humility and more about endurance. The once humble Hospitallers who had built hospitals for pilgrims now built fortresses for themselves. Their prayers were the same, but the tone had changed. What had once been a plea for mercy became a declaration of strength. In 1309, after years of searching and scheming, they found a new home, Rhodes. It was a rugged island of stone and salt, perched at the edge of empires, a place where East met West. The Byzantine rulers, weakened by internal strife, could not resist the disciplined and determined knights. Within months, Rhodes belonged to them. The barren island that had once been a trading post became a fortress of faith. The Grand Master moved his seat there, transforming the order into a maritime power. Rhodes became their crucible. Behind its thick walls, the knights rebuilt not just their stronghold, but their sense of destiny. They constructed harbors and shipyards, arsenals and churches, hospitals and granaries. Their fleets patrolled the surrounding seas, attacking corsairs and Ottoman vessels, capturing treasure ships and prisoners. The world called them defenders of Christendom. The Ottomans called them pirates. The truth was somewhere between. Their rule on Rhodes was absolute. The island's people lived under the order's law, a theocracy of swords and scripture. The Grand Master was both governor and priest, his authority rivaling that of kings. Every aspect of life, from trade to justice, was shaped by the discipline of the Brotherhood. The white cross of St. John flew above the citadel, its 8 points gleaming under the sun, a symbol of purity in a world that had forgotten what purity meant. Yet beneath the sanctity of their chapels, ambition stirred. The longer the knights remained on Rhodes, the more they began to see themselves not as servants of the Vatican, but as sovereign rulers. The Pope might grant them legitimacy, but their true power came from their fleets, their fortresses, and their fearsome reputation. They were a nation without borders, a faith without limits. Their independence grew quietly, one decree at a time, one successful battle after another. Their fleets became legendary, black-hulled galleys carved through the waves, their sails emblazoned with the cross. To friend and foe alike, their arrival meant judgment. They hunted pirates, seized Muslim ships, and intercepted Ottoman supply lines. But as their power expanded, so did their appetite. The line between holy war and privateering vanished. Gold, spices, and slaves flowed into Rhodes. The wealth that once funded hospitals now built palaces. Their vows of poverty became ceremonial words recited beneath ceilings gilded with their own prosperity. Still, the order justified everything in the name of faith. To serve God, they said, is to preserve his dominion. And yet, as they enriched themselves, whispers began to circulate in Rome. The Vatican saw what was happening. An order that owed its existence to papal blessing was becoming too powerful, too independent. The memory of the Templars still haunted the Church, and some wondered whether history was repeating itself. For the Knights, however, comparison to the Templars was both warning and inspiration. They had learned from their fallen brethren. The Templars had flaunted their wealth, defied kings, and trusted too much in the Pope's protection. The Hospitallers would not make the same mistake. Their secrecy deepened. Their internal codes grew stricter. Their archives were sealed, their councils guarded by oaths that could not be broken without blood. They began to move like shadows, silent, methodical, watching both their enemies and their supposed allies. By the 15th century, Rhodes had become a beacon, a fortress of faith surrounded by an ocean of hostility. The Ottoman Empire was rising, devouring the lands once ruled by Byzantium, pressing ever closer to Europe's heart. For the Knights, this was both a threat and a calling. They had been born in battle, and perhaps they believed they were destined to die in it. When Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, turned his gaze toward Rhodes, the order prepared for the inevitable. In 1480, the siege came. Thousands of Ottoman troops stormed the island, their cannons shaking the walls. The Knights, outnumbered 20-1, fought with a fanaticism that stunned even their enemies. For months the battle raged. The streets ran with blood. Churches became barricades. And when the smoke finally cleared, the cross still flew above the citadel. The Knights had survived, barely, but the price was immense. Half their brothers lay dead. Yet their victory, like so many before it, transformed into legend. In Rome, they were hailed as saviors of Christendom. But inside the order, something darker took root. The Knights began to see themselves as chosen instruments of divine will. Above kings, above popes, above the Church itself. Their faith had been tested by exile and fire, and they had emerged not humbled, but exalted. They no longer served merely as protectors of pilgrims. They believed they were protectors of God's will on earth. And so, while the world celebrated their endurance, another story unfolded in silence. The order's archives grew thicker, their alliances more secretive. Their connections spread into European courts and merchant guilds. Their agents whispered in the halls of kings. They had tasted sovereignty, and they would never surrender it again. Exile had forged their true nature. What began as wandering monks had become rulers of seas and secrets. Rhodes was no longer just their home. It was their proving ground. They had learned to rule without crown, to fight without fear, and to pray without obedience. Soon, however, the rising tide of empire would come for them once more. The Ottomans were patient, and the Vatican's trust was fragile. Another siege, another fall awaited. But the Knights of St. John were no longer mere exiles. They were something new, something the world had never seen before. They were becoming the Knights of Malta. When the cannons thundered again in 1522, the Knights of St. John already knew their fate. Rhodes, their fortress of faith for over 2 centuries, was about to fall. This time, the Ottomans came not with a single fleet, but with an empire behind them. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent sent 400 ships and 100,000 soldiers to crush an island defended by barely 7,000 knights, mercenaries, and civilians. Yet even as the walls trembled under relentless bombardment, the white cross of the order refused to bow. For 6 months, fire and iron rained upon Rhodes. The defenders fought like men possessed. Every tower, every stone, became a battlefield. They repaired the walls at night by torchlight, carried the wounded on their backs, and buried the dead before dawn. Their Grand Master, Philippe Villiers de l'Isle-Adam, led from the front, his armor scorched, his beard blackened with smoke. The chroniclers say that when Suleiman's messengers demanded surrender, the Grand Master's reply was a single sentence: "We are the soldiers of Christ. We do not yield." But faith cannot stop cannonballs. After half a year of siege, the city was reduced to rubble, its people starving, its hospitals filled with the dying. Even Suleiman, watching from his camp, began to feel something close to respect for his enemies. He offered terms, an honorable surrender. The knights could leave Rhodes with their banners, their weapons, and their relics. In an age of cruelty, it was a rare gesture of admiration between warriors. L'Isle-Adam accepted, not out of fear, but out of duty to preserve what was left of the order. On January 1, 1523, the Knights of St. John marched out of Rhodes in silence. The white cross still gleamed on their cloaks, though the men beneath it were hollow-eyed and broken. They carried with them the bones of their saints, the archives of their order, and the last fragments of a dream. Behind them, the Ottoman flags rose over the smoking ruins. The island that had once been their sanctuary was gone. Once again they were exiles, wanderers without a home, relics of a vanished crusade. But this time something in them had changed. They were no longer merely knights of faith. They were sovereigns without land, a government without borders. Their survival depended not just on swords, but on diplomacy, cunning, and secrecy. They drifted through Europe like ghosts, seeking a new base from which to rise again. For 7 long years they waited. The Pope promised them aid but offered little. Venice and France, once their allies, distrusted their independence. Even the Holy Roman Emperor hesitated. The world had changed, the Crusades were over, and the old orders of knighthood seemed obsolete. Yet the Knights of St. John refused to die. In 1527, the tides of fortune began to turn. The Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, saw in the Knights a potential asset against the Ottomans, who now dominated the Mediterranean. But he also saw their danger. An order too powerful could threaten even imperial authority. So he offered them a gift with hidden chains: the islands of Malta and Gozo, along with the North African outpost of Tripoli. At first, the knights hesitated. Malta was a barren rock, devoid of fresh water, with little vegetation and constant pirate raids. It seemed more a punishment than a gift. But L'Isle-Adam, now weary and old, recognized something others did not. Malta's position between Sicily and North Africa was perfect. It was a gateway to the central Mediterranean, a place from which the knights could once again dominate the sea. So in 1530, the knights sailed into the grand harbor of Malta. The people who watched from the shore must have wondered what kind of men these were. Sunburned warriors in tattered black robes, speaking in French, Spanish, Italian, and German, bearing the relics of saints and the discipline of soldiers. When they set foot on the island, the Grand Master knelt, kissed the dry earth, and declared, "We are home." But Malta was no paradise. The order found itself surrounded by enemies, short on supplies, and viewed with suspicion by the local population. The Maltese were farmers and fishermen. The knights were aristocrats of war. Tension simmered. The order built fortresses instead of farms, arsenals instead of homes. They prepared for another siege before anyone had even threatened them. They knew the Ottomans would not forget. The Sultan's advisors warned him that the knights' new base posed a long-term threat to Ottoman control of the sea. The order's ships began raiding again, striking Ottoman convoys, capturing treasure, and freeing Christian slaves. Within a decade, Malta became a symbol of defiance, a thorn in the empire's side. The knights rebuilt themselves faster than anyone expected. They fortified the island with walls and bastions so thick that later generations would call Malta the most fortified place on earth. They trained relentlessly, restoring the discipline that exile had eroded. Yet they also indulged in the wealth of the Mediterranean. Their palaces in Valletta gleamed with marble, their feasts overflowed with wine, and their coats of arms decorated every stone. The contradiction that had always haunted them, between piety and pride, was alive once more. Still, beneath the grandeur, the memory of Rhodes burned like a wound. The Grand Masters who followed Liladam carried that trauma with them. They swore that if the Ottomans came again, the knights would not flee a second time. They would hold Malta to the last man. And come they did. In 1565, Sultan Suleiman, now in his 70s, launched one of the most ambitious military campaigns of his reign, the Great Siege of Malta. He sent 200 ships and nearly 40,000 men, janissaries, corsairs, and siege engineers, to crush the order once and for all. Facing them were barely 9,000 defenders, including 600 knights and a few thousand Maltese militia. It was Rhodes all over again, but this time the order fought not just for survival but for redemption. The siege lasted 4 months. The Ottomans bombarded the fortresses of St. Elmo, St. Angelo, and St. Michael until they were piles of rubble. The defenders, led by Grand Master Jean Parasat de Valette, refused to yield. When the fortress of St. Elmo finally fell, only 9 knights remained alive. The Ottomans, exhausted and demoralized, could not believe that such few men had held out for so long. One chronicler recorded that even Suleiman's generals murmured, "If so small a fortress cost us so much, what will it take to take Malta itself?" When the Christian relief fleet finally arrived in September, the Ottomans retreated in humiliation. Malta was saved, and the knights had done the impossible. They had halted the advance of an empire. The victory turned them into legends once again, defenders of Europe and heroes of Christendom. But within their walls, they knew something had changed. They had proven their worth to the world, and in doing so had freed themselves from the Church's shadow. The Order of St. John was no longer merely a servant of the Vatican. It was a sovereign power, a nation forged in fire and sea. From their barren island, they ruled over fleets, wealth, and secrets that spanned continents. They were warriors, priests, and politicians, all under one cross. And somewhere in the echo of that victory, the Vatican began to wonder, had they created a monster? The victory at Malta in 1565 transformed the Knights of St. John from fugitives into legends. Across Europe, churches rang their bells, and poets called them the shield of Christendom. The world believed they had saved the West from the Ottoman tide. But legends are double-edged things. They inspire awe, yet they also conceal ambition. In the years that followed the siege, the knights began to change. What had once been a brotherhood of faith-hardened warriors evolved into something more complex. A power that was neither purely religious nor entirely political, but something in between, something secretive. Grand Master Jean Parasat de Valette, the hero of the siege, understood that the knight's survival depended not only on valor but on vision. Malta could no longer be merely a fortress. It had to become a symbol, a living monument that declared their divine endurance. So, in 1566, he laid the first stone of a new city, built from the blood and ashes of war, Valletta. It rose on the Sybaris Peninsula, overlooking the Grand Harbor, a city of bastions and golden limestone that would one day be called a city built by gentlemen for gentlemen. The construction of Valletta was both an act of devotion and defiance. Designed by military engineers and blessed by the Pope, it was meant to be impregnable. Streets ran in perfect grids to allow cannon fire to sweep through them if enemies ever entered. The buildings were grand, yet disciplined, no excess, no disorder, only strength. Beneath its surface, tunnels and storage chambers connected fortresses, secret routes carved to move men and information unseen. Every stone of Valletta carried a silent message. The knights were no longer servants of Rome. They were rulers of their own destiny. As Valletta grew, so did the order's influence. They began to mint their own currency, forge alliances with kings, and manage trade routes across the Mediterranean. The knights who once vowed poverty now presided over estates and treasuries that rivaled those of monarchs. They were landowners in France, Spain, and Italy. Their navy controlled key ports from Sicily to North Africa. Even the Vatican relied on them both for military aid and for intelligence. Yet this independence bred suspicion. Rome had never forgotten what happened to the Templars. Another brotherhood of warrior monks who grew too powerful, too wealthy, and too secretive. The memory of that betrayal still haunted the corridors of the Vatican. The Pope's envoys watched the knights carefully, noting how their councils were conducted in private, how their grand masters were addressed as princes, and how their loyalty to the church seemed more symbolic than real. The order still prayed to God, but their true allegiance appeared to be to themselves. By the early 1600s, whispers began to circulate through Europe that the Knights of Malta were not simply defenders of Christendom, but keepers of secrets, an elite society whose influence extended far beyond their island. Some said they controlled trade through coded maritime networks. Others believed they conducted secret rites in their chapels at night, rituals that blended Christian devotion with ancient mysticism. The truth was far murkier. What is known is that the order's hierarchy was fiercely guarded. To be admitted as a knight required not just noble blood but total secrecy. Each knight took oaths that bound him to silence regarding the order's inner workings. Meetings of the chapter general, their highest council, were closed even to many members. Their archives, kept beneath the Grand Master's palace, were locked behind multiple iron gates. Only the highest-ranking knights could enter, and the Pope himself, it was said, needed permission to read certain documents. Within Malta's fortified walls, the knights created a world apart, a society of rituals and symbols. Their coats of arms adorned every building. Their insignia marked every weapon. Even their daily routines were designed to remind them of their divine mission. Yet as generations passed, that mission began to blur. The younger knights, often drawn from European nobility, were less interested in piety than in privilege. Duels, feasts, and intrigues replaced vigils and prayers. The order's wealth funded not only hospitals and fleets but also lavish banquets and private palaces. The line between sacred duty and worldly indulgence faded. Still, beneath the decadence, the order's core remained unshaken, a belief that they were chosen. Their identity had been forged in fire, and that conviction could not be erased by time. But conviction alone could not stop change. The world beyond Malta was evolving. Empires were shifting. The Ottomans still loomed, but now another power was rising. The expanding shadow of Europe's monarchs. The knights' independence, once admired, now seemed inconvenient. France, Spain, and the Papal States all sought greater control over the Mediterranean. Malta's strategic location made it a coveted asset. The knights, who answered to no crown, became both useful and dangerous. The Vatican, too, faced its own challenges. Protestantism was spreading, reformers questioned the authority of Rome, and the idea of blind obedience was fading. In such a world, an independent order of armed monks was an anachronism or worse, a threat. Inside the order, divisions grew. Some knights remained loyal to the old ideal, a pure, religious brotherhood devoted to faith and charity. Others believed the order should embrace its sovereign nature and act as a true power, not merely a spiritual one. These factions clashed in council meetings and secret gatherings. Decisions about alliances, trade, and military campaigns became matters of politics rather than principle. And yet, even as their unity frayed, their mystique deepened. Visitors to Malta described the island as a place out of time, a blend of monastic solemnity and aristocratic grandeur. The Grand Master's palace shimmered with marble and gold. The co-cathedral of St. John, humble on the outside, glowed within like a jeweled reliquary, its walls painted with scenes of martyrdom and victory. Beneath the cathedral lay the tombs of generations of knights, rows of intricate mosaics depicting skulls, swords, and hourglasses, a silent reminder that even glory ends in dust. Yet for all their wealth and splendor, the knights lived under a gathering storm. By the late 17th century, piracy was waning, and the Mediterranean's balance of power was shifting. The great battles between Christians and Ottomans had given way to diplomacy and trade. The order's naval dominance faded. No longer needed as defenders, they struggled to define their purpose. The once feared knights became symbols of nostalgia, relics of a vanished crusade. But the Knights of Malta were not done yet. When history forgot them, they turned to secrecy. Beneath the surface of their institutions, a quieter transformation took place. The order began to focus on information rather than warfare, on intelligence networks, coded messages, and alliances hidden beneath charity. The same discipline that once guided their swords now guided their silence. And as Europe marched toward the modern age, the Vatican began to realize that the order it once blessed had become something different. Something independent, self-sustaining, and impenetrable. The Knights of Malta had survived exile, siege, and empire. But their greatest evolution was still to come. They were no longer fighting for land or faith. They were fighting for secrecy itself, and for the right to remain untouchable. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Order of St. John had become something of a paradox, a relic of the medieval world wrapped in the silks and shadows of the Enlightenment. Malta, their island stronghold, gleamed like a jewel in the Mediterranean, its fortresses magnificent, its harbors alive with trade and ceremony. Yet beneath the surface of ritual and reverence, a silent transformation was unfolding. The age of chivalry was dying, but the Knights of Malta were learning to survive in a new world by mastering the very forces that threatened to destroy them. The great victory of 1565 had made them heroes. For a century afterward, the knights had basked in their fame, building cathedrals, hospitals, and palaces that testified to their wealth and devotion. But time has a way of turning glory into burden. By 1700, Europe no longer needed crusaders. Empires fought over colonies, not faith. Science and reason challenged the power of the church, and new philosophies whispered that God was not found in battle or blessing, but in thought and progress. The order's ancient vows, poverty, chastity, obedience, began to sound like echoes from another age. Yet the knights endured, adapting in ways few could see. While they continued to present themselves as defenders of Christianity, their true power had shifted from sword to secrecy. Their fleets had grown smaller, but their influence reached deeper, into courts, banks, and the intricate web of European diplomacy. They possessed land and assets across the continent, from Provence to Lombardy, from Aragon to Austria. Each priory served as both religious institution and intelligence post, gathering information, money, and political leverage. Their leaders understood that survival now depended on subtlety, not siegecraft. The grand masters of the 18th century were not warriors but diplomats, men of refinement, fluent in intrigue. They entertained ambassadors, advised kings, and corresponded with popes. The order's archives in Valletta, already vast, became a labyrinth of correspondence, codes, and secret agreements. The knights' command of the sea had given way to command of knowledge. And knowledge in this new era was power. The Vatican, still wary of their independence, maintained a delicate balance. Officially, the knights were a religious order under papal authority. In practice, they acted as a sovereign state. The Grand Master minted coins bearing his likeness, maintained a standing army, and ruled Malta as an absolute monarch. The island became a kind of neutral ground, a crossroads where Christian and Muslim traders could negotiate under the watchful eyes of men sworn to God but loyal only to their order. Yet within this polished facade, fractures were forming. The young knights, drawn increasingly from Europe's noble families, viewed Malta not as a fortress of faith but as a playground of privilege. They came to the island to learn courtly manners, not martial virtue. The order's monasteries rang less with prayer and more with laughter and duels. Gambling tables replaced confessionals. Swords were drawn more often in drunken quarrels than in battle. Grand feasts, masked balls, and secret societies flourished in the palaces of Valletta. The ideals of the Enlightenment seeped into the order's walls like salt air. Knights debated philosophy, read Voltaire and Rousseau, and questioned the Church's authority in hushed tones. Some began to see themselves as enlightened aristocrats rather than servants of Christ. Others, clinging to the old faith, denounced these changes as heresy. The order was splitting, one half drawn toward modernity, the other chained to tradition. It was during this period of quiet division that rumors began to swirl across Europe, that the Knights of Malta harbored within their ranks a hidden circle, a secret inner brotherhood dedicated not merely to God but to knowledge forbidden by the Church. These whispers spoke of rituals held in catacombs beneath Valletta, of symbols etched into chapel walls that resembled not Christian crosses but alchemical sigils. Some claimed that the order had preserved manuscripts rescued from the Templars' archives before their destruction, writings said to contain lost wisdom from Alexandria, and even fragments of ancient Hermetic philosophy. Whether these tales were true or not, they spread like wildfire. The Knights became subjects of fascination and suspicion alike. Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and mystics across Europe claimed lineage from them, calling themselves heirs to a hidden spiritual science that stretched back to the Crusades. The Knights, for their part, neither confirmed nor denied such stories. Silence, after all, was their most powerful weapon. The Vatican watched uneasily. The Church's influence was waning, and the order's independence had grown too strong to control directly. Some popes sought to rein them in, demanding reforms and transparency. Others courted their favor, recognizing the Knights' vast network as a tool of diplomacy. But the order had become expert at playing both sides. They gave the Vatican loyalty in words, but in deeds they served their own interests. Still, no power lasts forever. The 18th century was a time of revolutions, and the storm would soon reach Malta's shores. Across Europe, monarchies trembled. The American colonies broke free, the French people rose against their king, and the very idea of divine right began to crumble. When revolutionaries in France declared that nobility and privilege were chains upon mankind, the Knights of Malta, an aristocracy of faith, found themselves relics of a hated age. Their estates in France were confiscated, their revenues cut off, and their influence diminished. The French Knights, once the order's wealthiest branch, were scattered or killed. The order's finances collapsed almost overnight. Grand Master Emmanuel de Rohan, desperate to preserve what remained, tried to reform the institution, making its hospitals and schools more visible to prove its charitable purpose. But it was too late. To the new world being born out of revolution, the Knights of Malta were an anachronism, symbols of power without purpose. And yet, in their decline, the Knights once again turned to what had always saved them: secrecy. They withdrew into silence, hiding their archives, disguising their alliances, and cultivating relationships with those who might protect them in the chaos to come. As nations fell and empires rose, the Knights adapted like ghosts, slipping through history's cracks, surviving where others perished. In the flickering candlelight of their chapter halls, they swore new oaths, not just to God, but to endurance itself. They had outlived kingdoms and crusades, and they intended to outlive the modern world too. The 18th century would end in revolution, but the Knights of Malta would not end with it. Though their power seemed broken, something deeper, something unseen, was taking shape beneath the ruins of the old world. A transformation that would one day pit them not against the Ottomans or heretics, but against the Vatican itself. The next battle would not be fought with swords or cannons. It would be fought with ideas, loyalty, and secrets, the weapons of a new age. The French Revolution tore through Europe like a cleansing fire, and the Order of St. John, the Knights of Malta, found itself standing in the path of history's fury. Everything they represented, nobility, hierarchy, divine right, and religious authority, was being dismantled brick by brick, head by head. In the streets of Paris, the guillotine's blade fell not just on monarchs, but on symbols of the old world. And though the Knights had long called Malta their home, their heart still beat in the courts and estates of Europe, particularly France. That heart was about to be ripped out. In 1792, the French revolutionary government passed decrees that stripped all religious orders of their property. The Knights' vast estates, the farms, manors, and commanderies that had funded their hospitals and fleets for centuries, were confiscated. Their revenues vanished overnight. Those knights who refused to renounce their vows were declared enemies of the people. Many were executed, others fled to England, Austria, or Italy. For the first time since the fall of Rhodes, the order faced the possibility of extinction. Malta, isolated and proud, remained untouched, for the moment. The island was still ruled by the Grand Master Ferdinand von Hompesch, a German nobleman more accustomed to diplomacy than war. Under his leadership, the order tried to maintain neutrality in a Europe on fire. They opened their harbors to ships of all nations and prayed that the storm would pass them by. But neutrality is a dangerous illusion when empires collide. And in 1798, the storm arrived in the form of a young French general named Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon's fleet appeared on the horizon in June of that year, carrying 30,000 men and a secret mission: to seize Malta as a strategic stepping stone to Egypt. He knew the island's importance. Whoever controlled Malta controlled the central Mediterranean. When his ships approached the harbor, the knights, bound by their ancient vow never to take up arms against fellow Christians, hesitated. It was a moment of hesitation that cost them everything. Napoleon demanded entrance for his fleet to resupply. Grand Master Hompesch refused, citing neutrality. The French general smiled and ordered an invasion. Within days, French troops stormed the beaches. The knights, unprepared and divided, mounted only token resistance. Their once mighty fortresses fell one by one. On June 12, 1798, the Grand Master surrendered Malta without a full-scale battle. After 268 years of sovereignty, the Knights of St. John were homeless again. The surrender shocked Europe. To many, it seemed impossible that the legendary defenders of Rhodes and Malta, men who had held back the Ottomans with their blood, had yielded so easily. Some whispered that treachery was involved. Others believed the order had grown too soft, too corrupted by comfort and politics to remember what it meant to fight. But for those within the order, the fall was not just a military defeat. It was a spiritual wound, a fracture in their very identity. Napoleon, pragmatic as ever, wasted no time. He looted the island's treasuries, seized the order's archives, and distributed the knights' properties among his officers. Then he sailed for Egypt, leaving Malta behind, but he had done his damage. The order was broken, its leadership scattered across Europe, its reputation tarnished. Hompesch abdicated, shamed and exiled. And yet, even in the ashes of defeat, the knights refused to die. Their survival instinct, honed over centuries of exile, siege, and suspicion, awakened once more. Within months of Malta's fall, a faction of the order began to reorganize in Russia, of all places. Tsar Paul I, fascinated by chivalry and drawn to the mystique of the knights, offered them protection. Though a devout Orthodox ruler and technically outside the Catholic Church, Paul accepted the title of Grand Master, a move that scandalized Rome. For the first time in history, the head of the Catholic Order of St. John was not Catholic. This act deepened the rift between the order and the Vatican. The Pope refused to recognize Paul's authority, declaring the Russian branch illegitimate. Yet the Tsar's patronage ensured the knights' survival. Under his protection, they found refuge, rebuilding their administration in St. Petersburg. The paradox was stunning: an ancient Catholic order reborn under the wing of an Orthodox autocrat, far from the Mediterranean and the shadow of Rome. In the candlelit halls of the Winter Palace, the surviving knights drafted new plans for their future. Some argued for returning to their spiritual roots, restoring hospitals and charitable missions. Others insisted on reclaiming their political sovereignty. But all agreed on one thing: Malta might be lost, but their order would endure. Their enemies, the French, the Ottomans, even the Vatican, had underestimated their resilience. When Tsar Paul was assassinated in 1801, the Russian chapter faltered, but the seeds had been sown. The order dispersed once more, with some knights settling in Italy, others in Austria and Germany. Gradually, they began to shift focus. The age of Crusades was over. The age of influence had begun. They used diplomacy, trade, and charity to reestablish themselves, not as warriors but as something subtler. It was during this period that the knights began to reshape their identity into what we might recognize today. They emphasized their humanitarian mission, reopening hospitals and providing aid to the poor. But beneath that charitable surface lay the same structure of secrecy, hierarchy, and control that had defined them for centuries. Their rituals remained unchanged. Their archives stayed sealed. Their councils continued to meet in private. For the Vatican, this transformation was both a relief and a threat. On one hand, the order's charitable work aligned perfectly with the Church's image. On the other, its autonomy remained an uncomfortable reminder that the Knights were never truly Rome's to command. The Pope reinstated the order officially in 1802, recognizing its continuity and allowing it to operate from Rome. But even then, the relationship was strained. The order had become a sovereign entity without territory, answerable to no earthly power, not even the papacy. As the 19th century unfolded, the Knights became ghosts of their former selves. Yet their ghostliness was precisely what made them powerful. Without land, they became ideas. Without armies, they became networks. In the new world of diplomacy and finance, where influence mattered more than fortresses, the order found a strange new relevance. Their members were nobles, diplomats, and military officers spread across Europe, men who could move quietly between capitals, bound by loyalty and secrecy. The fall of Malta had stripped them of walls, but not of purpose. If anything, it had freed them. No longer tethered to territory, they could operate anywhere. The sea that once defined them was replaced by something invisible. The ocean of power that flowed beneath governments, churches, and empires. And so, from the wreckage of revolution, a new kind of knight emerged. Not of the sword, but of silence. They had lost their fortress, but gained a far more formidable weapon: invisibility. And while the Vatican might have believed it had tamed them, the truth was the opposite. The Knights of Malta were evolving once again into something the Church could neither control nor fully understand. The 19th century was supposed to be the age of enlightenment, of progress, of nations marching boldly into the light of reason. But beneath that veneer of rationality, secret orders still moved in the dark, and none moved more carefully or more quietly than the exiled Knights of Malta. After their fall from the island fortress, they seemed to vanish from the world stage. Yet in reality they were not gone, only hidden. What had once been an order of crusading knights was now transforming into something altogether different. A spiritual brotherhood intertwined with politics, diplomacy, and the hidden arteries of European power. Their headquarters in Rome, a modest palazzo near the Aventine Hill, became a strange echo of their former glory. There were no fleets, no armories, no walls ringing with the sound of cannon fire. Instead, the halls were filled with maps, archives, and letters. The Grand Master's robes were still embroidered with the 8-pointed cross, but his hands now signed treaties rather than commands for war. It was as if the order had been reborn as a secret government without a nation. And while the Vatican allowed them space to exist, the Church still watched carefully. Old distrust lingered like a shadow between the two powers. During this period, the Knights reinvented themselves as masters of humanitarian diplomacy. They negotiated safe passage for Christian prisoners held by Ottoman forces. They organized medical relief in cholera outbreaks, and they quietly advised monarchs and ministers on matters of faith and policy. Their emissaries could be found in the courts of Vienna, Paris, and London. Men of noble birth who wore plain black cloaks and carried sealed letters stamped with the Maltese cross. The order had turned its old network of fortresses and ships into an invisible web of influence stretching across continents. This transformation did not happen by chance. It was deliberate, a survival strategy. Without Malta, without military strength, their only remaining weapons were discretion and reputation. So they cultivated both. They maintained their traditions of secrecy, their coded oaths, their layered ranks, and their rituals of initiation. Outsiders were intrigued by whispers of their gatherings. Dimly lit chapels, prayers in Latin, vows taken before ancient relics of the saints. To the curious public, they seemed like relics of a bygone age. To the few who understood, they were something more, a bridge between the medieval world and the modern age of secret societies. And indeed, this was the time when Europe was teeming with such orders. The Freemasons had spread through the salons of Paris and the lodges of London. The Rosicrucians had resurfaced with their cryptic philosophies. Even political movements like the Carbonari borrowed the language of secrecy and brotherhood. The Knights of Malta, older than them all, watched these new societies rise and saw opportunity. Their ancient prestige gave them access where others could only aspire. Masons respected them. Monarchs feared them. The church tolerated them. They stood at the crossroads of power and piety, both insiders and outsiders. By mid-century, as revolutions swept across Europe, from 1848 to the rise of Italian nationalism, the order faced a new challenge. The very city that hosted their headquarters was now at the heart of a movement to dismantle papal rule. The streets of Rome echoed with cries for freedom, for a new Italy unshackled from church control. The Vatican trembled. So did the Knights. If the Pope lost his temporal power, where would they stand? Would they be seen as defenders of the old order, or as relics to be swept away? Grand Master Giovanni Battista Cirsky a Santa Croce, who rose to leadership during this era, understood the danger. Under his direction, the Knights began to emphasize their neutrality, their commitment to service rather than politics. They opened hospitals for the wounded during wars, they provided aid during epidemics, and they began to build relationships with rising powers, even non-Catholic ones. Their mission became their camouflage. By serving all, they could survive among any. But neutrality was a delicate mask. In secret, the order's upper ranks continued to play their ancient game of influence. Through connections in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Vatican's diplomatic circles, and aristocratic families across Europe, the Knights acted as silent intermediaries. When monarchs quarreled, when borders shifted, when deals were struck in candlelit chambers, the Knights' representatives were often nearby, quiet, observant, unseen. And yet, for all their discretion, rumors persisted. Some claimed the order had infiltrated Freemasonry itself, blending chivalric ideals with Masonic ritual. Others whispered that the Knights were amassing secret funds, the remnants of Malta's lost treasure, investing in banks and shipping companies to restore their financial independence. A few even suggested that within the order, a more secretive circle existed, one devoted not to faith but to power. The Vatican, ever wary, began to quietly investigate. Reports circulated of secret meetings in Vienna and Munich, where symbols of the cross were mixed with symbols of the compass and square. If true, such alliances could mean that the Knights were no longer merely servants of God, but players in a deeper, older struggle between faith and reason, secrecy and light. Meanwhile, the world around them changed rapidly. Steamships replaced galleys. Empires rose and fell. Medicine advanced, and the idea of crusades faded into legend. Yet through it all, the order endured. Their hospitals were among the first to provide organized nursing during wars. They sent aid during the Crimean War, long before the Red Cross existed. It was said that wherever there was suffering, a man with a white eight-pointed cross would appear, silent, efficient, and loyal to no flag but his own. It was this dual image, the saintly healer and the secret knight, that fascinated the public imagination. Writers and intellectuals began to weave the order into fiction and conspiracy alike. Were they truly servants of the poor, or were they guardians of lost knowledge from the Crusades? Some speculated that their archives contained maps of Jerusalem's tunnels, relics of Solomon's temple, or even documents about the Templar treasure. The Knights neither confirmed nor denied. Silence, after all, was their greatest shield. By the end of the century, the Knights of Malta had mastered the art of invisibility. Their name appeared in charitable reports and hospital ledgers, but never in the minutes of political councils. And yet, wherever decisions were made in the twilight between church and state, whispers of their presence could be heard. They were no longer conquerors of land, but curators of influence, men who shaped outcomes without ever appearing in the light. And through all this, one question grew louder within the Vatican walls. Who truly commanded the Knights now? Were they loyal to Rome, or had they become their own church, a secret faith behind faith itself? The answer, perhaps, lay not in their public deeds, but in what they had preserved from the shadows of their past. The old codes, the sealed rooms, the oaths sworn in darkness. For every act of charity, there seemed to be a hidden purpose. Every mission of mercy a hidden message. The order had survived by learning the greatest secret of all: how to disappear while remaining everywhere. And by the dawn of the 20th century, their quiet metamorphosis was complete. The Knights of Malta no longer ruled from fortresses of stone. They ruled from silence itself. The dawn of the 20th century brought a new kind of warfare, one that could not be fought with swords or ships. Empires still rose and fell, but the battlefields had shifted to boardrooms, ministries, and secret meetings in smoke-filled rooms. The Knights of Malta, who had survived plagues, sieges, and revolutions, entered this new era as masters of something even more enduring than steel: influence. They had no land, no army, and yet, quietly, they began to shape the world in ways that no one could quite see or prove. In 1914, when Europe plunged into the First World War, the Knights faced an impossible question. How could an order sworn to neutrality survive a conflict that divided every Catholic nation? Germany, Austria, Italy, and France all had knights among their ranks. Brothers found themselves on opposite sides of the trenches, blessing soldiers who were about to slaughter one another. The Grand Magistry in Rome issued a declaration of impartiality, offering humanitarian assistance to all nations. It was a noble gesture and a strategic one. The Knights' hospitals became sanctuaries for the wounded of both camps. Their ambulances, marked with the white eight-pointed cross, moved between front lines where even the Red Cross feared to go. Their influence reached high command posts, where officers trusted them as neutral intermediaries. Beneath the cover of mercy, however, subtle diplomacy thrived. Letters passed through their channels, not all of them medical. Secrets, too, found safe passage beneath the banner of charity. The Vatican noticed. Pope Benedict XV, striving to act as a peacemaker, relied on the Knights for discreet communication with belligerent powers. Their couriers and emissaries, bound by sacred oaths and unburdened by national allegiance, were the perfect messengers. In those desperate years, the Knights became part of the Vatican's invisible diplomatic corps. They carried proposals for ceasefires, appeals for prisoner exchanges, and even drafts of papal peace plans. Not all their efforts succeeded, but their networks proved invaluable. After the war, Europe was unrecognizable. Broken empires, redrawn borders, rising ideologies. The old nobility that had sustained the order for centuries was in decline. Monarchies fell like chess pieces. Yet, amid the wreckage, the Knights endured, transforming again, like a shadow adapting to new light. They embraced the emerging language of international aid and humanitarianism. Their hospitals multiplied. Their name began appearing in reports from Geneva and the League of Nations, always in the background, always honorable, always elusive. But not everyone saw them as saints. As fascism began its dark ascent, the Knights' connections to Europe's aristocracy and the Vatican drew suspicion. Mussolini's Italy, eager to harness every institution for its regime, courted the order. The Grand Master, Ludovico Chigi Albani della Rovere, a descendant of popes and princes, walked a dangerous line. He maintained the order's independence, but not without compromise. The Italian fascist government praised the Knights' hospitals and rescue missions, even as it sought to claim them as symbols of national prestige. The Knights publicly aligned with no regime, yet they operated within them all, a balancing act that demanded exquisite caution. Then came the Second World War, a crucible that tested every claim of neutrality. Once again, Knights found themselves divided across enemy lines. Some served as medics in Nazi Germany. Others aided refugees in occupied France. Still others operated under Allied command. The Vatican, under Pius XII, leaned heavily on the order's discreet network to send aid to prisoners and to smuggle messages to bishops trapped behind front lines. Yet the same network could also be and was exploited by darker forces. It is here, in the fog of war, that the order's history becomes most obscure. After 1945, investigators searching for Nazi gold and the smuggling routes of war criminals stumbled upon curious coincidences. In documents seized by the Allies, the name Sovereign Military Order of Malta appeared in coded communications involving passports, safe-conduct letters, and transport permits. Some post-war fugitives carried documents stamped with the Maltese cross, legitimate or forged, no one could be sure. The order denied involvement, insisting that any misuse of their name was the work of impostors. But rumors persisted. Could it be that the same network that once carried papal messages had been repurposed, knowingly or not, to move men whose crimes were too great to be judged? The Vatican itself conducted quiet inquiries, but the results were never made public. What is known is that after the war, the Knights emerged not diminished but renewed. They were recognized by dozens of nations as a sovereign entity, a strange miracle for an order without land. They held diplomatic status, issued their own passports, and even minted coins and stamps. Their headquarters on the Aventine Hill became an embassy, technically sovereign territory, protected by international law. This was more than symbolism. It was rebirth. As Europe rebuilt, the Knights became indispensable to the Vatican's post-war humanitarian efforts. They ran hospitals, organized refugee aid, and distributed medical supplies across a devastated continent. Yet even as their reputation as humanitarians soared, whispers of their political entanglements grew louder. Some historians began to notice that many of their high-ranking members held positions in Western intelligence services, particularly in the early years of the Cold War. It made sense. Who better to operate in secrecy than an organization trained for centuries to do so? Their neutral status and diplomatic privileges made them ideal intermediaries. In Rome, Vienna, and Madrid, Knights were seen in conversation with diplomats, bishops, and generals. Their insignia opened doors, their faith earned trust, and their loyalty, once sworn to Christ and the Pope, now seemed to encompass a broader, more elusive cause: the defense of the West against the new infidel, communism. The Vatican, deeply anti-communist under Pius XII, saw the Knights as natural allies in this new crusade. They provided medical cover for missions behind the Iron Curtain, facilitated secret aid to persecuted Catholics in Eastern Europe, and worked with Western governments to build networks of influence. Officially, they remained neutral. In practice, they were now soldiers in a silent war, a war fought not with swords, but with information, charity, and faith. By the 1950s, the Knights of Malta were no longer relics of a medieval order. They were something entirely new, a hybrid of faith, diplomacy, and quiet power. Their ambassadors attended state dinners beside prime ministers and popes. Their influence reached from the Vatican's marble halls to the corridors of Washington and Moscow. Yet with this influence came questions. Had they truly survived to serve God, or had they learned to serve power in His name? Were they defenders of faith, or its secret manipulators? The Knights would never answer. Their silence was as disciplined as their history was long. But one truth had become undeniable. The Order of Malta had achieved what no other medieval power ever had. They had outlasted the empires that destroyed them. They had adapted to every age, feudal, imperial, revolutionary, industrial, and now modern, by mastering the art of reinvention. And as the 20th century moved deeper into its shadowy Cold War, the world would soon discover that the Knights' greatest transformation was yet to come. They had been warriors. They had been healers. Now they would become something far more dangerous, unseen architects of faith and politics alike. The Cold War was not fought on battlefields alone. It was fought in whispers, in coded messages, in handshakes exchanged under cathedral arches. It was a war of ideologies cloaked in religion, money, and secrecy. A perfect storm for an ancient order that had mastered all three. For the Knights of Malta, the fall of Europe's monarchies had once seemed like an ending. But as the Iron Curtain descended, it became their opportunity for rebirth. In a world divided by fear, their neutrality and mystique became valuable currency, and behind the facade of charity, a new kind of crusade began. The Vatican, reeling from the devastation of 2 world wars, had found itself in a perilous position. Communism was spreading across Eastern Europe, silencing churches, imprisoning priests, and crushing Catholic influence. Pope Pius XII saw it as an existential threat, a new kind of heresy that sought to replace faith with ideology. The Church needed allies, but it could not fight openly. It required intermediaries, organizations that could act quietly, move resources invisibly, and maintain plausible deniability. The sovereign military order of Malta was ideal. By the early 1950s, the order had diplomatic relations with more than 30 nations. It issued its own passports, operated under its own sovereignty, and answered only to its Grand Master, who in turn answered, in theory, to the Pope. But the truth was more complex. The Knights' independence allowed them to operate in spaces where official Vatican diplomacy could not tread. Under the banner of humanitarian aid, they established relief networks that stretched from Rome to Berlin to South America. But these same channels could also be used for other purposes to move information, funds, and sometimes people. In Washington, the order found unexpected allies. The early CIA, led by men who were often devout Catholics themselves, saw in the Knights an invaluable partner. Both sides shared a mission: to contain communism, defend Christian civilization, and prevent the spread of atheistic regimes. Some senior American intelligence officers, including generals and diplomats, were quietly invested as honorary knights. The Maltese Cross began to appear in the most unlikely places: at embassy banquets, intelligence briefings, and discreet fundraising events. The connections were subtle but undeniable. Allen Dulles, the legendary CIA director, was known to have deep ties to Catholic networks in Europe. William Donovan, the father of American intelligence and head of the OSS during World War II, was officially decorated by the Order of Malta for his service. Donovan wasn't just a spy master. He was a devout Catholic who believed in a global struggle between light and darkness. The Knights, whose entire mythology was built on that same duality, fit neatly into this worldview. It was during these years that whispers began of a white network, a loosely organized alliance of Catholic institutions, charities, and orders, all coordinating to fight communism. Some historians believe the Knights of Malta acted as the quiet nucleus of this network, providing legitimacy and cover for operations that ranged from propaganda to covert funding of anti-communist movements. Officially, they distributed food and medicine. Unofficially, they distributed hope and sometimes weapons. But even within the order, not everyone agreed with this direction. Traditionalists feared that their sacred mission of charity was being compromised. They argued that the Knights were becoming tools of governments rather than servants of God. Their warnings went largely unheeded. The world was changing too quickly, and the line between faith and strategy had blurred beyond recognition. Meanwhile, in Italy, something even more dangerous was brewing. The post-war years had seen the rise of secret political lodges, most infamously Propaganda Do, or P2, a Masonic network tied to businessmen, military leaders, and politicians. P2's influence stretched deep into the Vatican Bank and the Italian government. And as later investigations would reveal, certain figures connected to the Knights of Malta maintained quiet relationships with members of this shadowy organization. Whether these connections were ideological or merely opportunistic remains debated. But one thing is certain: the order had become entangled in a web of power that blurred every boundary between faith, finance, and espionage. During the pontificate of John XCI and later Paul VI, the Church underwent immense transformation. The Second Vatican Council opened the windows of faith to the modern world. Yet, for all its progressivism, the Church's oldest knights remained conservative, even reactionary. They viewed communism and secularism as existential threats to Christian civilization. For them, this was not merely politics, it was spiritual warfare. The 1960s brought chaos. Student revolts, the Vietnam War, the rise of atheistic movements, and growing unrest within the Church itself. The Knights responded by retreating further into their traditions, while simultaneously tightening their relationships with Western intelligence circles. Their humanitarian missions became increasingly global, in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, precisely where ideological battles were most intense. One striking example came during the civil wars and coups of Latin America in the 1970s. Officially, the Knights were there to provide medical aid. Unofficially, their relief flights and logistical channels often overlapped with those used by Western agencies supporting anti-communist regimes. It's not that the order was a direct participant, but in a world where information and logistics were power, their neutrality made them indispensable intermediaries. They could reach places no government could, and they could leave without trace. The Vatican saw their value but also their danger. Pope Paul VI attempted to reassert papal oversight, reminding the Grand Master that the order's sovereignty existed within the spiritual communion of the Holy See. It was a diplomatic rebuke, polite but pointed. Yet, the truth was that even Rome could not fully control the Knights anymore. Their independence, once a symbol of faith, had become a shield for autonomy. By the 1970s, their membership included princes, presidents, bankers, and generals. The order's official mission remained humanitarian, but its private membership list read like a directory of the global elite. Within the Vatican, some whispered that the Knights had become a state within a state, or worse, a church behind the church. Their diplomatic immunity, global reach, and access to power made them almost untouchable. And yet, their secrecy was also their curse. Scandals in the 1980s involving the Vatican Bank, P2, and mysterious deaths, most notably that of banker Roberto Calvi, found hanging beneath London's Blackfriars Bridge, drew renewed scrutiny toward Catholic institutions with hidden financial channels. The Knights' name surfaced in rumors, never in proof. But the mere association hinted at how deeply their networks ran. For the public, the Knights remained the noble heirs of medieval chivalry, men and women in white robes tending to the sick. For those who looked closer, they were something else entirely. The Vatican's invisible hand in a century of ideological warfare. They had outlasted kings, defied empires, and reinvented themselves through every transformation of the modern age. Now, as the Cold War reached its zenith, they stood not on the battlefield but at the nexus of faith, secrecy, and global power. And for the first time in centuries, whispers within the Vatican asked the unthinkable. Had the Knights of Malta become too powerful, even for the church that had once created them? The crusade that had begun 800 years earlier had not ended. It had merely changed its battlefield. The sword was gone, but the mission, the belief that God's will could be served through secret means, remained unbroken. And somewhere in the marble halls of Rome, beneath the banners of the cross, that mission was quietly evolving once more. The 1980s began with smoke, secrets, and scandal swirling through the marble corridors of the Vatican. The world was changing again. New wars, new technologies, new ideologies. But some battles were fought with the same ancient weapons: loyalty, faith, and silence. And in the shadows of these struggles, the Knights of Malta, the oldest surviving order of Christian knighthood, found themselves standing at the center of a web that stretched from the Holy See to Wall Street, from Rome to Washington, from whispered rituals in candlelit chapels to high-level boardrooms where billions moved without trace. It started, as such things often do, with money. The Vatican Bank, officially known as the Institute for Works of Religion, was supposed to handle the church's finances for pious causes, missionary work, hospitals, education. But by the late 1970s, it had become a labyrinth of offshore accounts, shell companies, and secret transactions. And somewhere within that labyrinth, the symbols of the Maltese cross began to appear. The Knights of Malta had long been involved in humanitarian finance, managing donations and assets for hospitals and aid projects. But the lines between charity and investment were blurring. Their unique sovereign status allowed them to operate internationally with privileges most banks could only dream of. They could move funds across borders, issue passports, and maintain diplomatic pouches immune from inspection. For governments, they were sacred. For those seeking discretion, they were invaluable. Among the names linked to these networks was Roberto Calvi, head of Banco Ambrosiano, a powerful Italian bank with deep connections to both the Vatican and the Order. Calvi's bank began collapsing under mysterious debts in the early 1980s. When investigators tried to untangle the mess, they discovered offshore accounts tied to Catholic organizations, secret orders, and coded references to M. Some believed M stood for Malta. Others thought it meant money, or Masons, or both. Then came June 1982. Calvi was found hanging beneath London's Blackfriars Bridge, his pockets stuffed with bricks and thousands of dollars in cash. The press called him God's banker. The scene was grotesque, theatrical, and symbolic. The Blackfriars were the old Dominicans, the Black Brothers. To some, the location was no accident. It was a message. Calvi had been involved with Propaganda Due, the same secret Masonic lodge that had infiltrated Italy's government and military. P2's members included generals, industrialists, and high-ranking clergy. Among them were names that overlapped with circles of the Knights of Malta. The Vatican denied everything. The Knights said nothing. But those who investigated found threads connecting Calvi's bank to accounts used by Catholic charities, some administered under the order's humanitarian branches. Were these coincidences? Perhaps. Or perhaps they were the traces of a centuries-old system of financial secrecy that had outlasted empires. While the scandal unfolded, the order continued its outward work: hospitals, relief missions, and disaster aid. On paper, they were saints in uniform. Yet behind that saintly image, the Vatican itself was uneasy. Pope John Paul II, who ascended to the papacy in 1978, was a man of strong will and sharp intuition. He admired the order's charity but distrusted its autonomy. He knew the danger of powerful institutions that lived in shadows. He had grown up under totalitarian regimes that hid control behind noble language. During his pontificate, the Pope quietly commissioned audits, inquiries, and reforms across the Church's financial arms. But the Knights were difficult to touch. They were not technically under Vatican jurisdiction. Their sovereignty, recognized by international law, made them immune to direct oversight. Their Grand Master answered to the Pope spiritually, but politically, the order answered to no one. And yet, even John Paul II understood their strategic value. In the 1980s, the world was again polarized. The Soviet Union loomed, and the Church was engaged in a spiritual and political war for the soul of Europe. The Knights' influence within the intelligence and diplomatic circles of the West made them indispensable. Their global network could move supplies, funds, and information faster than most governments. And in Poland, the Pope's homeland, they played a quiet role in supporting Solidarity, the underground movement that helped bring down communism. Officially, they sent medical aid and supplies to workers. Unofficially, they smuggled hope. At the same time, in Latin America, the order's presence grew during the turbulent years of military dictatorships. In countries like Chile and Argentina, their humanitarian efforts sometimes coincided suspiciously with covert Western operations. Hospitals and clinics run under the Maltese banner became safe zones for intelligence contacts. Missionaries served as couriers. Documents moved in plain sight. It was charity but also cover. As the 1980s waned, the Knights' dual nature was sharper than ever. To the world, they were angels of mercy. To insiders, they were guardians of something older and more complex. A network of faith-based diplomacy that blurred the lines between holy duty and worldly intrigue. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and with it, the Iron Curtain. Communism, the great enemy, collapsed. For most institutions tied to the Cold War, this was an ending. But for the Knights of Malta, it was an opportunity. They were quick to re-establish contacts in Eastern Europe. Within months, their humanitarian missions appeared in Poland, Hungary, and the former Czechoslovakia. They opened hospitals in Russia, medical programs in Ukraine, and relief centers in the Balkans. But behind this resurgence was a question that Vatican officials dared not voice. What now would become of an army built for a crusade when the crusade had been won? The answer was subtle. The Knights turned inward, into charity, diplomacy, and global presence. But some members, especially within the European elite, saw the post-Cold War vacuum as a stage for influence. In 1990, the order's diplomatic reach expanded dramatically. They now had full relations with more than 70 countries and permanent observer status at the United Nations. No other organization of its kind, a medieval religious order without territory, had achieved anything comparable. The Vatican looked on with mixed emotions. The Pope himself blessed their work but reminded them, pointedly, that sovereignty is service. Beneath that blessing was a warning. The order's power was tolerated only as long as it served the Church's mission. But the Knights were no longer merely a Church instrument. They had become a global actor in their own right, sovereign, independent, and utterly opaque. Inside the order, divisions deepened. Some wanted to return to their spiritual roots, emphasizing humility and healing. Others believed the Knights' unique status could shape world affairs, that their centuries of diplomacy and their connections to power could help broker peace in a fractured age. But peace and power have always been uneasy companions. As the century drew to a close, the knights stood at a crossroads. Their medieval past still hung over them like a banner, one of crusades and fortresses and vows of poverty. But their present was one of influence, wealth, and global reach. To many within the Vatican, they no longer resembled monks or knights, but something altogether modern. An elite brotherhood operating beneath the surface of world politics, wearing the cross as both symbol and shield. In private, some church officials began referring to them as the Pope's diplomats without borders. Others, less charitable, called them the Vatican's Freemasons. The irony was bitter. The knights had spent centuries opposing the secret societies they now resembled. Yet through scandal, suspicion, and survival they endured, just as they always had. Their motto remained unchanged: Tuitio Fidei et obsequium pauperum, defense of the faith and service to the poor, and perhaps, in their own mysterious way, they still believed in both. But faith, they had learned, could be defended not only with swords and ships, but with silence, sovereignty, and secrets. And as the 20th century closed, the Knights of Malta had perfected all three. The dawn of the 21st century brought the Knights of Malta into a world they had never known before. One of satellites, global surveillance, and instantaneous communication. The days of whispered letters sealed with wax and secret meetings in candlelit chapels were over, replaced by emails, digital archives, and online scrutiny. Yet for all the transparency the modern world claimed to offer, the Knights somehow remained cloaked in the same mystery that had surrounded them for nearly 1,000 years. To some, they were a relic that had miraculously survived history's relentless march. To others, they were a silent force adapting to every new era, always finding ways to retain power under the guise of service. In 2001, the world shifted again. The September 11th attacks changed everything: geopolitics, diplomacy, and even the nature of faith itself. Nations began to realign, intelligence agencies forged new alliances, and old networks were reactivated in the name of security. Within this new paradigm, the sovereign military order of Malta suddenly found itself relevant once more. Their embassies, spread across more than 100 countries, offered quiet channels for negotiation and information exchange at a time when official diplomacy often failed. Their medical missions became cover for dialogue between groups that could not publicly meet. The order's sovereign status allowed it to move humanitarian convoys across borders that even the United Nations struggled to access. But it wasn't just charity. The early 2000s saw the reemergence of the order's political influence in subtle, often overlooked ways. High-ranking members, businessmen, aristocrats, and retired military officers were placed at the crossroads of humanitarian policy and global strategy. The U.S., which had long viewed the Knights as allies in both spiritual and geopolitical terms, began including them in discussions about refugee crises and post-conflict aid. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the Maltese flag appeared on medical tents in war zones where few dared to go. The image was powerful: white eight-pointed crosses standing out against deserts of blood and ruin. Behind the scenes, however, something deeper was stirring. The order was growing richer. Its donations had multiplied, its endowments expanded, and its connections with major corporations, particularly in Europe and the U.S., were stronger than ever. For an institution that took vows of poverty, it was ironic. Wealth and secrecy rarely coexist without consequence. Rumors began to swirl of private investments, discreet holdings, and philanthropic portfolios that blurred the line between charity and commerce. Some insiders whispered that a handful of knights were using their positions not to serve the poor, but to protect their own interests, and that the Vatican was taking notice. The Holy See had always regarded the knights with a mix of admiration and caution, but by the mid-2000s, that caution turned into quiet unease. The order had become so independent that it was functioning almost like a parallel government, one with diplomatic immunity, global reach, and no democratic oversight. The Pope's envoys could advise them, but not command them. And yet, the Knights continued to speak of loyalty to the Church while defending their sovereignty tooth and nail. In 2008, the world economy trembled. The global financial crisis exposed fragile systems everywhere, from Wall Street to the Vatican's own bank. Once again, questions arose. How much money did the Knights of Malta truly control, and where was it? Their official reports were spotless, their humanitarian efforts visible and impressive. But investigative journalists who tried to trace the order's finances hit a wall of sovereign privilege. Records were sealed, offshore accounts untouchable. What little emerged painted a picture of complex structures designed to keep wealth fluid and untraceable. All officially, for the support of charitable works. Still, crises have a way of revealing character. When the European refugee crisis exploded in the 2010s, the Knights were among the first to respond. They deployed ships and medical teams across the Mediterranean, rescuing thousands from drowning. The world applauded them. Journalists called them the last true knights. For a moment, the Order's ancient mission shone again, pure and undeniable. But even that light cast long shadows. Some European politicians accused the Knights of cooperating too closely with certain governments, of selectively aiding migrants depending on political affiliations. The Maltese cross, once a symbol of impartial mercy, was now seen by some as a diplomatic tool. Then, in 2016, the fragile balance between the Order and the Vatican finally cracked. It began with something seemingly small, a dispute over the distribution of contraceptives by a charity connected to the Order. The Vatican demanded accountability. The Grand Master, from Matthew Festing, resisted, claiming the Order's sovereign rights. Behind the public disagreement, however, there were larger forces at play, questions of money, governance, and influence. The Pope intervened personally, ordering an internal investigation. For the first time in centuries, a sitting Grand Master was asked to resign. It was a modern echo of the 1798 crisis, when the Order had lost Malta to Napoleon. The world's media framed it as a clash between old power and new papacy, tradition versus reform. Pope Francis, known for his disdain of opulence, saw the Knights' lavish ceremonies and aristocratic titles as relics of a bygone age. But within the Order, his actions were seen by some as an attack on their independence. The ancient Brotherhood that had outlived kings and emperors now found itself at odds with the very church it had sworn to defend. The internal fractures deepened. Some members sided with the Vatican, calling for transparency and reform. Others whispered that the Pope was being manipulated by modernists who wanted to dismantle the last vestige of sacred chivalry. Anonymous letters circulated, accusing high-ranking knights of corruption, nepotism, and betrayal of vows. It was the same pattern that had haunted the Templars centuries before. Accusations of secrecy, wealth, and heresy. History, it seemed, was repeating itself in a different form. But there was one crucial difference. This time, the world was watching. The media, the internet, and the age of leaks meant that the Order could no longer hide behind centuries of obscurity. Journalists uncovered lists of wealthy donors, connections to political movements, and unexplained property holdings in Europe and beyond. The Vatican's investigation led to internal reforms, but also to resentment. Many wondered whether the Order's sovereignty, the very heart of its identity, would survive. And yet, amidst this turmoil, the core of the Order endured. Its hospitals still operated in war zones, its volunteers still fed the poor, its doctors still risked their lives in disaster zones. The contradiction was breathtaking. An organization both ancient and modern, saintly and shadowed, loyal yet defiant. The Knights of Malta had weathered crusades, plagues, invasions, and papal decrees. They had seen empires rise and fall. Now they faced their most insidious enemy, irrelevance. In a world that no longer believed in mystery, could an Order built on faith and secrecy survive? Or was the Maltese cross destined to fade into history, a symbol stripped of meaning? As the decade closed, the question lingered, unanswered, heavy, and haunting. For the Knights, survival had always meant adaptation. But adaptation, as history had shown, often came at a cost. The old Brotherhood stood once more at the edge of transformation, its white cross gleaming faintly against the twilight of modern faith, waiting for the next great test, and the next secret that might define its fate. When the dust settled from the Vatican dispute, the Order of Malta stood at a strange crossroads, wounded yet unbroken. The resignation of Grand Master from Matthew Festing in 2017 had sent shockwaves through the ranks, marking one of the most dramatic confrontations between the Vatican and the order since the Napoleonic era. For many inside the Brotherhood, it felt as though a sacred boundary had been crossed, as though the Church, once their mother and ally, had become an overseer. Yet, in true Maltese fashion, the order responded not with rebellion, but with quiet resilience. Centuries of survival had taught them that silence and patience were their strongest weapons. The months that followed saw an uneasy peace take hold. Pope Francis appointed a special delegate to oversee internal reforms, signaling that the Vatican would now play a more direct role in the order's affairs. For outsiders, this might have looked like victory, the Church finally asserting control over its ancient offshoot. But within the ranks of the Knights, whispers began again. The reforms, some said, were not just about governance or morality. They were about sovereignty, about stripping the order of what made it unique. At the heart of the conflict lay a question as old as the order itself. What does it mean to be both a religious brotherhood and a sovereign entity? For the Vatican, the answer was simple. The Knights were a Catholic order, bound by obedience to the Pope. But for the Knights themselves, it was not so clear. Their sovereignty had been recognized by international law, their ambassadors received by nations, their passports respected worldwide. They had embassies, coins, and their own constitution. To surrender that sovereignty would be to erase the very essence of what had allowed them to endure for 900 years. Behind the scenes, a subtle power struggle unfolded. On one side stood those loyal to the Vatican's vision of reform, knights who believed the order's spiritual purity must be restored, that titles and wealth had corrupted its soul. On the other were the traditionalists, men of old families and deep influence who feared that reform would mean submission, the slow death of independence under the polite smile of papal diplomacy. Both sides spoke of faith, service, and history, but beneath those words lay an ancient human hunger for control. The transition years that followed were marked by quiet turbulence. Meetings behind closed doors, contested elections, and diplomatic maneuvering defined the order's new era. The world, distracted by pandemics, wars, and political upheaval, barely noticed the centuries-old Brotherhood locked in its internal crusade. But for those within, the stakes felt eternal. Would they become merely another Catholic institution, or remain the world's oldest sovereign entity without territory? A nation of faith without land? The outside world continued to view the Knights through their public face. Doctors in refugee camps, aid workers in disaster zones, volunteers dressed in red tabards marked with the white Maltese cross. Their humanitarian mission expanded across continents. During the Syrian civil war, they established field hospitals near the borders of Lebanon and Turkey. Their convoys crossed minefields and deserts to reach civilians trapped between armies. In Africa, their hospitals treated thousands affected by famine and disease. The Knights' medical wings were praised by the United Nations and other NGOs for their efficiency and neutrality. And yet, even in these acts of mercy, the old duality persisted. Their diplomatic status allowed them access to areas where few could go, and in doing so, they sometimes became intermediaries between factions, governments, and powers that officially did not speak to each other. Aid became negotiation. Healing became leverage. The order's humanitarian reach was also a form of influence, soft power draped in the robes of charity. In Rome, the Vatican quietly observed, aware that every new mission reinforced the Knights' independence. Pope Francis continued to press for reforms, greater inclusion of lay members, transparency in finances, and a reassertion of spiritual discipline. But change came slowly, resisted by centuries of hierarchy and pride. The Grand Magistry, still located in the majestic Palazzo Malta on Rome's Via Condati, remained a fortress of tradition. There, portraits of long-dead Grand Masters lined the walls, their eyes seeming to watch every modern debate with silent judgment. The internal discussions were fierce. Could women hold leadership roles in the order? Should the aristocratic requirement for certain ranks be abolished? What did chivalry mean in a world without swords? These questions, once unthinkable, now defined the order's identity crisis. Some members feared modernization would erase everything sacred. Others believed the only way to survive was to evolve, to open doors that had been closed for centuries. Amid these debates, new figures emerged. Younger members from across the world, Asia, Latin America, Africa, began to bring fresh perspectives. They spoke not of nobility or sovereignty, but of mission and faith. To them, the order's power lay not in its titles, but in its service. They envisioned an order less obsessed with ceremonial grandeur and more connected to its founding vows: defense of the faith and service to the poor. But even as these idealists rose within the ranks, the old guard held firm. Many of the order's wealthiest patrons, men and women of immense influence, saw no reason to change. They had long used the Maltese cross as a symbol of prestige, a link to a chivalric past that legitimized their modern fortunes. Behind the smiles and ceremonies, politics played out in whispers. Favors traded, alliances forged, secrets exchanged. Some said the Vatican itself was divided, that even within the Curia, factions debated how far Rome should go in taming the order. In 2020, as the world was engulfed by the COVID-19 pandemic, the Knights once again found purpose in crisis. Their hospitals and volunteers were among the first to respond across Europe and the Middle East. Their centuries-old motto, Obsequium Pauperum, service to the poor, took on new life. For a time, the internal divisions were forgotten. The Maltese cross flew over field hospitals in Italy, Lebanon, and Iraq. It was a reminder that, despite its politics, the order could still summon extraordinary compassion when the world needed it most. And yet, in the quiet aftermath, the old questions returned. What future awaited an order that walked the line between faith and power, service and sovereignty? Could the Knights ever truly reconcile their medieval soul with the demands of a modern world? Or was their destiny, as it had always been, to remain a paradox? In 2022, under papal guidance, new reforms were finally approved. The order's constitution was rewritten for the first time in decades. The changes reduced the autonomy of certain offices and increased the Pope's oversight. For the Vatican, it was a triumph, a restoration of spiritual order. For the traditionalists, it was a wound. The Maltese sovereignty, they said, had been humbled. But even that was not the end. Beneath the visible structure of reform, the old spirit endured, the conviction that the Knights of Malta were more than a religious order or a humanitarian NGO. They were, in their own eyes, the last defenders of a sacred lineage, warriors of faith without a battlefield, guardians of secrets too ancient to die. And so, even in a world of transparency and data, the Knights continued to live as they always had, half in the light of charity, half in the shadow of mystery. Their story, it seemed, was not one of endings but of transformation. The cross still gleamed, stark and pure, against the red of their robes, a symbol of suffering and salvation, pride and humility, a reminder that some institutions, no matter how the centuries turn, are bound not by history, but by destiny. The Order of Malta had survived another storm, but beneath the calm surface, the ripples of change were spreading wider than ever before. The reforms of 2022 had reshaped the structure of the order, at least on paper, but what no decree could rewrite was the psychology of those who wore the Maltese cross. Within the vaulted halls of their Rome headquarters, the air was thick with both reverence and resentment. Tradition-bound knights, whose families had served the order for generations, murmured that sovereignty had been sacrificed to papal politics. Younger members countered that sovereignty meant nothing if the order lost its soul. It was the same conflict that had haunted the Brotherhood for centuries, between those who saw the Knights as an instrument of divine authority and those who viewed them as a sovereign state of conscience, answerable only to God. To understand the tension of this new era, one had to understand what the order had become. In the 21st century, the sovereign military order of Malta was a paradox made flesh, a nation without territory, an army without weapons, a government of faith without citizens. Its embassies were active in more than 110 countries. Its flag flew at the United Nations. Its passports, though few, were recognized by many states. Its Grand Chancellor held meetings with ministers and monarchs. Yet, when one stripped away the ceremonial robes and Latin titles, It remained an order of knights bound by vows that dated back to the Crusades. This contradiction gave the knights their power and their fragility. In private, diplomats often admitted that the order was invaluable precisely because of its ambiguity. It could operate where states could not, offering neutral ground in negotiations that needed discretion. During the migration crises that followed the wars in Syria and Libya, the order's humanitarian branches quietly facilitated talks between European and North African officials. In parts of the Middle East, their medical missions doubled as listening posts, gathering intelligence for humanitarian strategy, and sometimes, according to unconfirmed whispers, for Western governments. The Maltese Cross opened doors that even official embassies could not. But while the Knights' reach remained vast, their unity was cracking. The 2022 constitutional reforms had created two competing factions that now defined the order's internal landscape. On one side were the reformists, knights who believed that humility, transparency, and inclusivity were essential for survival. They argued that the medieval aristocratic hierarchy no longer reflected the world the order served. On the other side stood the traditionalists, led by powerful European families who had long dominated the order's upper echelons. They saw reform as betrayal, an erosion of sacred tradition in favor of modern politics. To them, the Maltese Cross was not a brand or an NGO logo, but a sacred insignia forged in the fire of the Crusades, symbolizing a divine calling that could not be negotiated. Tensions reached a quiet boiling point during the election of the new Grand Master. The process, always steeped in ritual and secrecy, became a mirror of the order's divide. Behind closed doors in the chapter general, the order's equivalent of a parliament, debates turned into confrontations. Some knights demanded that the next leader be a man of spiritual strength, one who could reconcile the order's faith with the modern world. Others demanded a statesman who could protect their sovereignty from Vatican oversight. Every speech echoed the same anxiety, that the order was no longer master of its own destiny. Outside the walls of Rome, few understood how profound this internal struggle was. To the public, the knights remained an emblem of charity and tradition, the men and women who provided disaster relief, ran hospitals, and served the forgotten. Their humanitarian branches were more active than ever, responding to earthquakes, floods, and wars. The world saw compassion. Only insiders saw conflict. Yet, in every historical cycle of the order's existence, turmoil had always been the prelude to rebirth. The fall of Rhodes, the exile from Malta, the loss of European patronage. Each disaster had forced the knights to adapt, to rediscover their purpose beneath the rubble of old power. Perhaps the current crisis was no different. Within the Vatican, Pope Francis continued to press for change. He envisioned an order that was less of a noble club and more of a spiritual force. To his critics, this was naive. To his supporters, it was prophetic. The Pope's interventions had reminded the world that no matter how sovereign the knights claimed to be, their identity was still bound to Rome's blessing. But even Francis seemed to understand the irony. The knights' independence was also their strength. The Church might control their rules but not their influence. In 2023, a subtle shift began to unfold. The Order's leadership announced a new strategic vision for the decade ahead. The focus would be on global humanitarian diplomacy, a phrase carefully chosen to merge their ancient chivalric identity with their modern political role. Behind the rhetoric lay a simple truth. The Knights intended to remain relevant in the post-pandemic, post-globalization age by becoming a moral mediator in a fractured world. Their embassies began to act as meeting grounds for interfaith dialogue, particularly between Christian and Muslim communities, a poetic echo of their origins in the Crusades, when they had served both pilgrims and prisoners regardless of faith. But even as they embraced diplomacy, the old symbols persisted. In Rome and Valletta, ceremonies of investiture continued. Candles flickered against the red of the robes, Latin prayers filled the air, and the same vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience were spoken. Yet beneath the solemn ritual, a different kind of oath was forming, one not spoken aloud, an unyielding promise that the order would survive, no matter who tried to reshape it. Some historians began to call this era the invisible renaissance of the Knights. They noted that despite internal conflicts, the Order's public influence was expanding again. It was quietly increasing its role in health diplomacy, disaster response, and cultural preservation. In the shadows of geopolitical tension, between East and West, between faith and secularism, the Knights positioned themselves as the world's conscience in armor. They could not wage war anymore, but they could still wield influence like a sword. And yet, even as they adapted, the ghosts of their past refused to fade. Whispers circulated of secret archives within the Grand Magistry, records that detailed the Order's hidden dealings across centuries, from the Inquisition to the Cold War. Journalists and historians tried to gain access, but requests were always denied. The archives remained sealed, guarded under the justification of spiritual confidentiality. What stories lay within them? What pacts, what betrayals, what miracles? No one outside the Order truly knew. Those who had walked its corridors described portraits of past Grand Masters illuminated by golden lamplight, each painting seeming to follow you with eyes that had seen everything and forgotten nothing. Beneath those watchful gazes, the new Knights debated, dreamed, and doubted. The Order, once a fortress of certainty, had become a sanctuary of questions. As the 2020s moved forward, one truth became clear. The Knights of Malta were not fading into history. They were transforming once again, not into soldiers, not into priests, but into something more elusive. They were becoming symbols of continuity in a world that worshipped change, keepers of a code that refused to die. Their battles were no longer fought on seas or citadels, but within boardrooms, treaties, and consciences. And perhaps that was the greatest secret of all, that after 1,000 years, the Knights of Malta had not merely survived history. They had learned to shape it from the shadows. The Order remained what it had always been, half holy relic, half living riddle, a bridge between faith and power, past and future, light and the endless mystery that flickers just beyond it. In the heart of Rome, on a narrow street that winds toward the Tiber, stands the Palazzo Malta, the Order's ancient headquarters. To passers-by, it seems like just another elegant building from the Baroque age. But behind its heavy wooden doors and centuries-old crest lies a realm that still guards its secrets with almost supernatural discipline. Visitors who are permitted entry often describe the same sensation, the feeling of stepping out of time. The air is quiet, thick with history. Every marble stair, every oil painting, every relic speaks of a lineage that refuses to die. And though the city around it hums with modern chaos, the Order's walls hold an unbroken stillness, the silence of power that has learned to whisper instead of shout. It is within these walls that the new Grand Master, a man both humble and calculating, has begun to steer the Order through one of the most delicate transitions in its history. His election was hailed as a moment of unity, a bridge between the reformists and traditionalists. A knight of noble birth but modern sensibility, he understood that to preserve the Order's independence, it would have to change, but without appearing to change. That paradox, as old as the Order itself, now defined every decision he made. He began by re-examining the Order's purpose in a fractured world. The days when faith alone could guide policy were long gone. The Knights had to redefine what defense of the faith meant in a century of cynicism, where religion was often met with suspicion and politics had become its own form of worship. His answer was subtle but daring. The Knights would become mediators of moral diplomacy, a phrase he coined in his inaugural address. They would stand not as preachers, but as witnesses, not as conquerors, but as keepers of human dignity. It was a vision that appealed to many. Under his leadership, the Order's influence began to ripple outward again. They expanded their partnerships with secular governments, NGOs, and international organizations, proving that their ancient vows could coexist with modern governance. Their hospitals multiplied in Africa and the Middle East. In Ukraine, they organized medical convoys at the height of the Russian invasion, treating the wounded on both sides. The neutrality that had once defined them as healers of Crusaders and Muslims alike returned in spirit. The world saw white ambulances bearing the Maltese cross, the same symbol that had once adorned Crusader shields, racing across battle-scarred roads. The irony was poetic. 1,000 years after they first marched under that emblem, The knights were once again at the crossroads of faith and conflict. Only now, their weapons were bandages, medicine, and negotiation. The cross that once terrified enemies now gave hope to strangers. But behind this revival of purpose, the undercurrents of secrecy still flowed strong. The Order's finances remained impenetrable, its archives sealed, its internal communications hidden behind layers of tradition and protocol. The Vatican had hoped its reforms would open the doors of transparency, but what it achieved instead was something subtler, an illusion of openness. The Knights published annual reports, detailing charitable expenditures and humanitarian programs. Yet the true flow of power, influence, and money remained invisible, encoded within centuries of sovereign immunity and diplomatic privilege. It was said that the Order had friends in every government and secrets in every century. A diplomat once joked that, if the Knights ever opened their archives, half of Europe would lose its sleep. Another remarked that the Maltese cross was the only flag in the world that could enter both war zones and royal banquets without raising suspicion. Inside the Order, however, whispers grew louder that the Grand Master's reforms, though inspiring, risked awakening the Vatican's scrutiny once again. The Holy See, though outwardly supportive, had not forgotten how easily the Knights' sovereignty could slip beyond control. Some curial officials worried that the Order was regaining too much influence too quickly, forging relationships that rivaled the Vatican's own diplomatic channels. The Grand Master's charm and discretion were legendary, but even charm has limits in Rome, where memory is eternal and politics moves in centuries, not years. By 2024, a quiet but unmistakable transformation had taken root. The Order's ranks were expanding beyond their traditional European base. In Asia, Africa, and South America, new knights were being admitted, professionals, scholars, physicians, individuals with no aristocratic background, but with deep commitment to humanitarian service. To some, this was a new dawn. To others, it was blasphemy against the old code of nobility. A rift began to widen again, this time not over papal reforms, but over identity itself. What did it mean to be a knight in the modern age? Could knighthood still exist without nobility? Could an order that had once required proof of centuries-old lineage now accept a doctor from Nairobi or a volunteer from Manila as its equal? To the reformists, it was the natural evolution of their mission, the universalization of chivalry. To the traditionalists, it was the death of everything sacred. The Grand Master, aware of the peril, walked a careful line, giving speeches that invoked tradition while quietly advancing inclusivity. As the debate unfolded, the outside world began to take renewed interest in the Order. Journalists probed its dual nature, the humanitarian and the political. Conspiracy theorists revived old tales, that the Knights of Malta were the true heirs of the Templars, that their archives contained evidence of lost relics, even that their diplomatic immunity was used to transport more than just medicine. Most of these claims were fantasy, but they served the same function they always had, to remind the world that the Knights were not merely a charity, but an enigma. For the members themselves, that mystery was both burden and blessing. They wore the cross knowing it carried centuries of blood and sanctity. They understood that every act of service, every bandage wrapped, every refugee rescued, was also a whisper to history. We are still here. In a time when faith was commodified and virtue politicized, the Knights' endurance seemed almost miraculous. In the quiet of the Palazzo Malta, late at night, the Grand Master often walked the corridors alone. It was said he would pause before the portraits of his predecessors, men who had defended islands, led fleets, negotiated with popes and kings. Their painted eyes seemed to follow him, asking the question that every Grand Master had faced since the fall of Jerusalem: will you preserve what we built, or will you be the one to let it die? He would not answer aloud. Perhaps he knew that the answer lay not in preservation, but in transformation. The Order's history had proven one immutable truth: survival depended on reinvention. The Knights had been monks, warriors, exiles, diplomats, and humanitarians. Now they were becoming something else, symbols of conscience in a world adrift. Outside, Rome slept. The Tiber murmured its eternal song. And within the high walls of the Palazzo Malta, the light of the cross flickered faintly in the dark, fragile, eternal, waiting. The knights had survived plague, invasion, and exile. They would survive this new century too, not because they were immune to change, but because, like the faith they served, they had mastered the art of enduring it in silence. For in the end, that was their true secret, not wealth, not power, not even faith, but endurance itself. The ability to stand between worlds unbroken, while time itself forgot everything else. The Order of Malta's rebirth in the modern age was not only a matter of diplomacy or charity, it was a resurrection of purpose, a rediscovery of what it truly meant to serve. But like every rebirth, it came with growing pains. The outside world saw the white crosses on humanitarian convoys and called it goodwill. But inside the order, something far deeper and more dangerous was unfolding. A battle for the soul of an institution that had survived every empire it had once served. The Vatican had reasserted its influence, but it could not fully erase the order's stubborn independence. Within the high walls of their sovereign headquarters, the Knights of Malta still governed themselves according to their own laws, their own codes, their own unspoken alliances. In the private chambers of the Palazzo Malta, meetings stretched late into the night, not about war or conquest but about vision. What was the Order's destiny now that the age of crusades and empires was over? Could faith and sovereignty coexist in a world where the Church itself was losing its grip on nations and souls alike? Among the younger generation of knights, men and women who had joined not because of heritage but conviction, a quiet revolution was stirring. They spoke of transparency, of reform, of bringing the Order's immense resources to the front lines of humanitarian crises, rather than letting them languish in hidden accounts or ceremonial functions. They looked at the gleaming relics and marble halls of Rome and wondered if all that grandeur still served the mission of mercy. To them, the Order was not a relic of medieval pride but a living organism, one that must adapt or perish. The older knights watched this movement with unease. For them, tradition was not just memory, it was the last defense against oblivion. They feared that in chasing modern relevance, the Order might lose the sacred mystique that had kept it apart for 1,000 years. Once the rituals faded, they believed, so too would the reverence. The oath of chivalry would dissolve into the language of bureaucracy, and the Knights of Malta would become just another NGO, stripped of its ancient soul. The Grand Master stood between these two worlds, his heart caught between the past and the future. He saw the fervor of the young and the caution of the old and understood that both were right, and both were wrong. For without faith the Order was nothing, but without action, faith was an empty relic. In his private letters, he often wrote that the cross we bear is not the one carved in stone, but the one that asks us to choose, again and again, between devotion and survival. Outside the Order's walls, the world was changing faster than it had in centuries. Wars no longer followed banners or kings, but ideologies, algorithms, and markets. The old lines between good and evil blurred into a fog of propaganda and profit. In such a world, the Knights' ancient code, defense of the weak, protection of the sick, faith above all, seemed almost naive. Yet, paradoxically, that naivety became their strength. Where governments hesitated, they acted. Where corporations counted profit, they counted lives. Their ambulances rolled into refugee camps in Syria, their doctors operated under fire in Sudan, and their envoys negotiated access to war-torn regions where no flag could safely fly. They called it neutral compassion, a phrase that carried both humility and defiance. The Vatican praised their efforts publicly, but privately, some officials grew uneasy. The Knights of Malta were becoming too visible, too effective, too admired. They were earning the world's trust, something even the Church itself struggled to maintain. It wasn't the first time Rome had felt threatened by its own champions. The story had played out before, with the Templars, the Jesuits, the Franciscans. The pattern was almost divine in its repetition. Faith gives birth to power, and power inevitably awakens suspicion. Within the Holy See, murmurs began to circulate once again. Quiet, measured, and dangerous. Are the knights loyal? Some asked. Or are they independent? Meanwhile, within the Order's private councils, discussions grew bolder. Some members began advocating for complete sovereignty, the formal recognition of the order as a neutral, non-religious humanitarian state, much like the Red Cross. It was an audacious vision, the transformation of a medieval Catholic order into a modern, faith-inspired republic of mercy. But others saw it as heresy. The idea that the Knights could exist apart from papal authority struck at the very heart of their spiritual legitimacy. The debates became fierce, though always hidden behind ritual and politeness. Behind the golden doors of the Grand Council chamber, where portraits of Crusader lords stared down from the walls, words were spoken that could have shaken the foundations of centuries. "If sovereignty is our gift," one knight reportedly declared, "then why do we still kneel?" The Grand Master did not answer immediately. He looked instead at the seal engraved into the marble floor, the 8-pointed cross, each arm representing the Beatitudes. "Because," he said softly, "to kneel is to remember who we are." His words ended the debate for the night, but not the struggle beneath it. By now, the Order's activities had expanded into over 100 countries. They managed hospitals, refugee centers, and schools, a global web of compassion operating under a sovereign flag recognized by more than 100 governments. Yet, despite their visibility, the mysteries of their structure remained intact. Their membership rolls were never fully disclosed. Their finances, despite audits, were never transparent. And their diplomatic missions, each one cloaked in immunity, moved through the world with a freedom that even the Vatican envied. It was this combination of holiness and secrecy that fascinated historians and unnerved politicians. The Knights seemed to belong to two worlds at once, the ancient and the modern, the visible and the hidden. To the devout, they were relics of chivalry reborn. To the skeptical, they were an enigma, a reminder that faith, when armed with diplomacy, could still command the stage of global power. In this age of doubt, that duality made them almost mythical. While the Church struggled to retain believers, the Knights of Malta grew in quiet influence. Their work spoke louder than sermons. Their presence commanded respect without demanding worship. But their very success carried a subtle danger, the same danger that had doomed their predecessors 7 centuries earlier. When faith becomes effective, power follows. And when power rises beyond control, history always demands its price. Late at night, as the city of Rome fell into its soft hum of sleep, the Grand Master stood once again on his balcony overlooking the Tiber. The moonlight reflected off the ancient river, turning it into a silver ribbon stretching toward eternity. He thought of Jerusalem, Rhodes, Malta, the lost homes of his order, and wondered if their exile had ever truly ended. Perhaps the Knights were destined never to rest, never to belong, always to serve in motion, between loyalty and autonomy, between God and man. The wind carried the faint toll of distant bells from St. Peter's Basilica, a reminder that though the Vatican's shadow was vast, the Cross of Malta still glowed in its own light. The Grand Master whispered a prayer not for victory, but for clarity. For he knew that the next battle would not be fought on the sea or in the field, but within hearts, within faith itself. And somewhere in the quiet corridors of the Palazzo Malta, a candle flickered before an old relic, a sword once carried by a Hospitaller knight during the siege of Rhodes. Its blade, though dulled by centuries, still caught the light. Perhaps, the Grand Master thought, the sword was no longer meant to cut, but to reflect. The reflection shimmered faintly on the wall, a symbol not of conquest, but of endurance. The kind that outlasts kingdoms, popes, and time itself. The years that followed were years of silence, the kind that only powerful institutions know how to keep. Outwardly, the Order of Malta thrived. It expanded its humanitarian operations, its presence at the United Nations grew more visible, and its diplomatic missions multiplied across continents. The world saw images of the Maltese cross painted on aircraft, ships, and relief convoys rushing toward disaster zones. In interviews, its representatives spoke with humility and conviction, calling their mission a continuation of mercy through centuries. But behind that calm exterior, the Order stood on the edge of another transformation, one that few outside its walls could perceive. Inside the Palazzo Malta, a quiet unease had begun to stir. It was not rebellion or scandal this time, but something subtler, deeper, a question of identity. As the modern world grew more secular, the very concept of a religious military order seemed anachronistic, even absurd. Yet, paradoxically, the more the world forgot its sacred roots, the more the knight's existence seemed to haunt it, like a living echo of an older truth that refused to die. The Grand Master sensed it first, a growing disconnection between the order's body and its soul. The work continued, efficient, global, admired, but the spirit that once defined the knights was fading beneath layers of bureaucracy and diplomacy. He saw knights who spoke more about funding and logistics than prayer and devotion. The eight-pointed cross, once a mark of sacrifice, now adorned business suits and gala invitations. And though the world respected their deeds, few remembered the vow that bound every true knight, the defense of faith above all. One evening, in the stillness of the Order's chapel, the Grand Master prayed before the relic of St. John the Baptist, their ancient patron. His words, whispered in the candlelight, were not for the world but for the Order's own soul. "Lord," he murmured, "if we must be your soldiers still, then teach us where the battle lies." It was around this time that the Order faced a new kind of crisis, one that no crusade could prepare them for. The digital age had made secrecy impossible. Information that had once been locked behind stone walls could now be exposed with a keystroke. Journalists, activists, and data analysts began probing the Order's finances and affiliations, uncovering inconsistencies and shadowed transactions. Some claimed that the Knights' sovereign status was being used as a loophole by wealthy patrons, that tax havens and diplomatic immunity were being exploited under the banner of charity. The accusations were not entirely unfounded. For centuries, the Order had balanced idealism with pragmatism, holiness with politics. Donations from the rich had always fueled missions for the poor. Yet, in the ruthless glare of modern transparency, the old justifications no longer seemed pure. The Vatican, ever sensitive to scandal, grew uneasy. Once again, there were calls for oversight, audits, and reform. And once again, the Order resisted, politely, diplomatically, but firmly. Sovereignty, they reminded Rome, was not a gift to be revoked. It was a right forged in blood and centuries of service. But even among the knights, a question began to echo in private conversations. Can an order born of faith survive in a world that worships exposure? The Grand Master called for a conclave, a rare gathering of the Order's highest dignitaries from every continent. They met within the vaulted halls of the Priory of St. John in Rome, surrounded by ancient banners and marble tombs. For 3 days and nights, debates raged, not over power or wealth, but over meaning. The younger knights demanded openness, arguing that transparency was the truest form of honor in the modern age. The elder members countered that mystery itself was sacred, that to reveal too much was to profane what should remain holy. On the final night, the Grand Master rose to speak. His words, recorded in the Order's private minutes but never released publicly, became known as the Testament of the Cross. "We were born," he said, "in an age when belief was life and doubt was death. We healed men not because they were Christian, but because we believed all suffering was sacred. Yet now we heal the body and forget the soul. We speak of neutrality when the world cries for faith. My brothers and sisters, if the light of the cross fades, no wealth, no hospital, no title will save us. We will become another name in history's ledger, noble in memory, but dead in spirit." His words fell heavy, and for a long time no one answered. It was not condemnation that silenced them, but recognition. They knew he was right. In the months that followed, the Order began a subtle renewal, not in its structure, but in its purpose. Chapels were reopened within their hospitals. Knights were required once again to take part in silent retreats before assuming office. The daily prayer of the Order, long neglected, was reinstated as a ritual before every mission. Small changes, perhaps, but profound. It was as though the soul of the Order, long buried beneath diplomacy, had begun to breathe again. Meanwhile, the world around them grew darker. Wars flared, refugees multiplied, and faith waned. Yet in these crises, the knights found their meaning renewed. When humanitarian groups withdrew from danger zones, the Knights of Malta stayed. When politics made neutrality impossible, they prayed, acted, and endured. Their quiet resilience became a paradox of the modern era, an ancient faith functioning more effectively than modern institutions. In Syria, one field medic described it best. They arrive without cameras, without conditions. They just serve. And when they leave, you realize they've been here longer than governments, longer than borders. But not everyone saw virtue in their persistence. Intelligence agencies began to take notice of the order's unusual freedom of movement. Their convoys crossed borders with little interference. Their communications were encrypted under diplomatic privilege, and their leaders met heads of state without press coverage. Some speculated that the order's neutrality made it the perfect conduit for covert negotiations, perhaps even intelligence exchanges between nations that could not otherwise speak. The Vatican dismissed such theories as conspiracy, but they persisted nonetheless. After all, secrecy was the order's oldest habit. Through it all, the Grand Master aged quietly. His once black robes now faded to gray. He had become the symbol of endurance, a figure both respected and enigmatic. Those close to him said that he spent more time in prayer than in council, and that in his final years he often spoke of Malta, the island fortress that once bore their name. "We lost a home," he said once. "But perhaps that is what kept us faithful. Faith is not meant to rest. It is meant to wander." One winter evening, as rain washed over Rome, the Grand Master was seen walking through the courtyard of the Palazzo Malta, alone, his hands clasped behind his back. He stopped beneath the great stone cross above the entrance and gazed upward for a long time. A young knight passing by asked if he was well. "Yes," the old man replied softly. "I am only listening." "Listening to what?" the knight asked. "To history," he said. "It still speaks." And with that, he turned and disappeared into the hall, leaving the young knight standing in silence, staring at the cross glistening in the rain. Ancient, steady, and unchanged, the Order of Malta would continue, as it always had, through crisis and controversy, through reverence and doubt. For theirs was a secret not of conspiracy or power, but of endurance, the secret of how to keep faith alive in a world that had forgotten what faith was. And somewhere in that balance, between secrecy and service, between the Vatican and the world, the Knights of Malta remained exactly what they had always been, the last guardians of a code too sacred to fade, too mysterious to explain, and too powerful to die. In the aftermath of the Grand Master's twilight years, the Order of Malta entered a period of reflection, one that would test not its strength, but its faith in itself. For nearly a millennium, the Knights had survived by mastering the art of transformation. They had been warriors, healers, diplomats, and ghosts in the corridors of power. But now, as the 21st century unfolded in all its digital chaos, they faced an adversary unlike any before: irrelevance. Not destruction, not suppression, but the slow erosion of meaning in a world that no longer believed in sacred vows. The election of a new Grand Master came at a critical time. He was a man of quiet intellect, educated in theology and geopolitics, a bridge between tradition and the restless modern world. When he stood before the chapter general in his black robe, the eight-pointed cross glimmering faintly over his heart, there was a moment of collective hope, the same fragile hope that had followed every great transition in the Order's long history. He promised renewal without revolution, faith without fanaticism. But beneath his calm demeanor lay an awareness that he was inheriting not just authority, but an ancient burden, to keep the flame alive when even believers grew weary of light. The Vatican watched his rise with careful interest. The wounds from the previous power struggle had not fully healed. Though the Holy See and the Order maintained a delicate peace, trust was thin, like fine glass stretched over centuries of friction. The Grand Master knew he must walk carefully. His sovereignty was both a shield and a snare. It allowed him to act freely, yet one misstep could trigger another papal intervention. In private, he once confided to his closest aide, "We are not the Vatican's servants, nor its enemies. We are its reflection, the shadow cast by faith when it stands before power." Under his leadership, the Order turned its gaze inward once more. The Knights began restoring old traditions, reviving lost prayers, and reopening archives sealed for generations. Historians and scholars were invited, cautiously, to study the manuscripts kept in the vaults of the Palazzo Malta, documents that traced the order's journey from Jerusalem to Rhodes, from Malta to Rome. Some spoke of secret treaties, forgotten relics, even encoded messages from the Crusades. Most of the findings were mundane inventories, letters, medical records, but occasionally, a discovery hinted at something extraordinary. Reports of relics smuggled during the fall of Constantinople, letters exchanged with exiled popes, or cryptic maps drawn in the margins of prayer books. It was during one such archival restoration that a curious artifact emerged. A weathered piece of parchment bearing the order's seal, dated from the early 16th century. It described a meeting between the Knights of Malta and unnamed guardians of the temple. The text was fragmentary, written in Latin and French, and scholars debated its meaning. Some believed it referred to remnants of the Templar order. Others dismissed it as myth. But within the order, the document stirred old whispers, that the Knights of Malta had inherited not only the Templars' mission, but their secrets. The Grand Master, ever cautious, ordered the document to be secured and studied privately. History, he said, is our inheritance, but some histories are still alive. News of the document never reached the public. Yet word traveled quietly through academic circles, and before long speculation began anew. Were the Knights of Malta the true successors of the Templars? Did they guard relics of unimaginable significance? Or was it all a romantic illusion, a myth preserved to maintain the order's aura of mystery? Whatever the truth, the effect was undeniable. Attention turned once again to the Knights. Media outlets published documentaries, books, and essays exploring their lineage and secrecy. Conspiracy theorists wove tales connecting the order to everything from papal assassinations to global diplomacy networks. The Grand Master, seeing the rising tide of fascination, neither denied nor confirmed. He understood something his critics did not. Mystery itself was a form of power. To explain too much was to be forgotten. To reveal too little was to endure. But not all mysteries could be controlled. Within the order, new divisions were beginning to appear, subtler, quieter, but no less dangerous. Some of the younger knights began to see their mission less as an extension of the church and more as a global moral order, a network of conscience that transcended religious boundaries. They believed that the Cross of Malta should stand for universal compassion, not just Christian faith. Their rhetoric was idealistic, inclusive, and increasingly secular. To them, the order's history was a legacy of service, not of creed. The older members, however, saw this as heresy in modern disguise. They feared that the order was slowly surrendering the very essence that had given it meaning. Without the faith, one elderly knight warned during a council meeting, "We are nothing but diplomats in robes." His words echoed the warnings of centuries past, the eternal tension between faith and function, between God and the world. The Grand Master listened to both sides and said little. In private, he struggled with the same dilemma that had haunted his predecessors. He knew that to preserve the order's relevance, it needed to evolve. Yet to evolve too far was to lose its soul. The order's dual nature, sacred and sovereign, religious and political, was both its strength and its curse. And like all who had worn the Grand Master's robes, he bore that paradox like a second cross upon his shoulders. In the following years, the Knights of Malta undertook missions that once again placed them at the heart of global crises. In Yemen, their field hospitals treated victims of famine and airstrikes. In Eastern Europe, they helped resettle refugees displaced by conflict. Their banners appeared in forgotten corners of the world, always quiet, always efficient. Yet behind the scenes, diplomats and intelligence agencies began to take note. The order's convoys and communications moved with a freedom that defied political boundaries. In war zones, they spoke to all sides, obeying none. Some began to suspect that the order was once again becoming a silent player in the chessboard of nations, a neutral conduit through which whispers and agreements could pass unseen. After all, who would question a Knight of Malta carrying aid when, in truth, he might also be carrying information? The Grand Master denied nothing, confirmed nothing. He smiled when asked about such things, and his only reply was, "We have always carried messages, some for the body, some for the soul." But in his private chambers, he often reflected on the fragility of it all. He knew that history had a cruel symmetry. Whenever the order grew too influential, too admired, or too mysterious, it drew the attention of those who sought to control it. And he feared that the next reckoning might come not from the Vatican, nor from kings, but from the invisible powers of the modern world, governments, corporations, and algorithms that sought to quantify every secret, every soul. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the domes of Rome, he stood on the balcony overlooking the city and whispered a line from Scripture. "The truth shall make you free." Then, almost as if answering himself, he added, "But freedom demands a price." In that moment, he understood the timeless curse of the Knights of Malta. To live forever at the edge of power, to serve without ruling, to protect without being trusted, to believe without proof. It was a balance few could endure, and yet, for nearly 1,000 years they had. And as nights settled over the Tiber, the lights within the Palazzo Malta glowed faintly against the darkness, like beacons from another age, silent, patient, and eternal. The years that followed were marked by silence, not the absence of activity, but the kind of silence that hides beneath diplomacy and ritual. The Order of Malta seemed calm on the surface, conducting its charitable works and international missions with polished grace. Yet behind closed doors, the Grand Master's Council met more frequently, their discussions veiled in secrecy. There were murmurs of growing tension between the knights loyal to traditional vows and those pushing for modernization, whispers that the Order's ancient soul was being traded for influence. In one meeting within the stone walls of the Palazzo, a senior knight stood and addressed the Grand Master with trembling conviction. "We are no longer warriors of faith," he said, "but negotiators of convenience." His words hung heavy in the candlelit room. The Grand Master did not respond immediately. He knew there was truth in that accusation. The world had changed, and so had they. But he also knew that to survive, the Order had to wear many faces, as it always had. Outside those walls, global politics shifted once more. Nations fractured, alliances blurred, and new forms of conflict emerged. Not of swords and ships, but of data, propaganda, and covert influence. Strangely, this new age offered the knights a familiar role. Their neutrality, their ancient status as a sovereign entity beyond borders, made them ideal intermediaries in crises where others could not tread. Quietly, their envoys began appearing in unexpected places. Conflict zones, closed-door summits, digital humanitarian councils. And yet, every step forward seemed to pull them further from the divine simplicity of their founding vow, to defend the faith and care for the poor. The cross they wore still gleamed, but its meaning had shifted. Some saw in it a symbol of persistence, others a mask for power. As the Grand Master aged, he often walked the Order's private chapel late at night, his footsteps echoing off marble floors once trodden by centuries of brothers before him. He would kneel before the relic of St. John and whisper, "If the world no longer believes in us, then what are we defending?" Perhaps that was the question the Order could never escape, the question that bound its destiny. For even in silence, even in uncertainty, the Knights of Malta endured, as they always had. An enigma between faith and empire, between the Vatican's blessing and the world's suspicion. The torches of the past still burned within their walls, faint but unextinguished, the last light of an order too ancient to die, and too proud to fade away. In the soft hush of Rome's twilight, the Order's story felt suspended between myth and memory. Within the Palazzo Malta, candles burned beside centuries-old portraits, eyes of long-dead knights seeming to watch the living with silent judgment. Outside, the city thrummed with life, unaware that behind those heavy doors, history still whispered. The world had changed, yet the knights endured, adapting with each century's demands, their purpose shifting but their vow unbroken. No banners flew, no battles raged. Their war now was against indifference, against the fading of meaning in an age of noise. In every quiet act of mercy, in every secret negotiation to save a life, they wove the same ancient promise. to serve, to protect, to believe. And perhaps that was the truest defiance of all, not rebellion, but devotion that refused to die. Somewhere in that stillness, between faith and shadow, the Knights of Malta remained, not as relics of a forgotten crusade, but as guardians of a mystery the modern world could no longer name, yet somehow still needed. In the weeks that followed, Rome seemed to hold its breath. The order moved with deliberate quiet, as though aware that every gesture would echo louder than words. The Grand Master's reform slowed, but they did not stop. Within the chapel, the knights prayed, not for victory, but for clarity. Outside, the world turned, indifferent yet curiously drawn to this ancient brotherhood clinging to relevance in an age of disillusionment. In distant hospitals and refugee camps, the Maltese cross still fluttered over tents and convoys, a relic that refused to fade. And perhaps that was the true secret all along. Not hidden relics or coded archives, but endurance itself. The Knights of Malta had survived every betrayal, exile, and accusation because they had mastered the one art that outlived empires: persistence. Their strength was not in defiance of the Vatican, but in defiance of time. As dawn broke over the Tiber, the Grand Master stood at his window, sunlight glinting off the cross at his breast. The church might forget, nations might fall, but the order endured, a living echo of faith's stubborn flame, flickering still against the vast silence of history. Dawn broke over Rome, golden light spilling across the domes and ruins, a city of faith and fracture. Within the Palazzo Malta, the Grand Master knelt alone before the altar, the cross of the order gleaming faintly above him. Outside, the world moved on, unaware that 1,000 years of defiance still breathed behind those walls. The Vatican's decree would come, the debates would rage, but the knights would endure, as they always had, in shadow and in service. For some truths do not die. They retreat, waiting for a world worthy enough to remember them.